Hello, everyone. Right now, I'm currently waiting to speak with Lucy, our friend, Lucy Haze, about Jewishness, Jewish history, and other things like that. So, I was trying to like move stuff around in my room, but I don't know. Hello,
Hello,
hello.
hello. Wait,
Yes,
I have to make the game quiet now again. Hello, welcome again.
yes.
Now that you're here, I have, you will be represented with the, as you can see you have been designated with here you go, you're being symbolized.
I'm being symbolized.
Yes, for now, until I turn on your camera. For now, you're being symbolized by my kitty that has passed away, sadly.
Oh, so sorry to hear that.
Oh, it was some time ago already, but it's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's okay now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Well, it took me a while, but I finally was able to reset everything up, sort of.
It's true. It's good to do. It's good to reset.
Yeah.
Reset your levels of, yes.
Hi,
No.
Zara. It's so good to see you.
Yes. Should I turn myself on? Should I be turned on to use a very easily to misunderstand language?
If you so wish. If you so wish.
Alright. Because you're streaming right now, right?
Yes, I am streaming right now.
All right,
At first I couldn't, but now I finally can.
In that case, I will be turned on.
Indeed.
I have to turn myself off here. Deactivate. Because my camera just cannot handle, sort of. Oh my gosh. Okay, what do I do now? Oh.
The duckies are calling.
How did that work again?
If you click soundboard, that reminds me. I need to change the camera on here too.
There we go. Now we are both here, and I have to think of a way to make us.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, Zara. I never expected to be good at technology in my life, and somehow I had to learn how to.
I never expected to be good at technology, and I'm still not.
Let's see here.
Yes. So I've been able to tell gossip. I've been able to tell big stories. I've been able to spill the beans on lore and on my mom's rehab visit.
Oh, okay. Well, I do hope that she's doing better.
Oh, she is. She's doing actually very good physically, thanks to the initial fundraiser that happened.
Okay, good. So, I know we had left off at me talking about Yiddishkeit and Deutschkeit, and I wasn't sure if you wanted me to go back to that, or if you wanted to ask like another question.
Before you continue, because I understand the fear of this, like, universalized and sort of blanket thing, right? But I also think that, like when I asked my mom, and she said that to her Jewishness is a way of life and also belonging to a community. And I do think that there is a case to be made for a broader international Jewish community, even if there are differences. I think those differences just make the overall community just stronger and better. Like when I went to the Shabbat dinners, the dinners were at their best when there were a lot of different types of people in it, when there were people that were like Ashkenazi and Sephardic people, people of basically all possible races, all possible backgrounds, and we just, we just existed during that Shabbat dinner, did various things, different types of singing, different types of, enjoying each other's company, and I think it just enriches the whole thing. Like if we sort of are I think there's a case to be made for a broader sort of international community that sort of just um, embraces the diversity.
Mm-hmm. Well,
What do you think?
I think one thing too is like now it's come to a point where it exists whether we want to or not, right? Right? Like it's like I guess I don't want to necessarily put it in a negative sense, but it's like there is one, right? Like there is one, right? And that one has been created over the centuries, right? Like through the different migrations, through the different interconnections, etc. Right? Like it wasn't just Ashkenazi Jews that lived, say, in Krakow, right? It was also
Yeah,
some Sephardim. It was also people that had come from Palestine. It was
yeah,
and so and even like the community in like the Al Baghdadi family. I mean the name bespeaks where they came from
yeah,
originally, right? From Baghdad, and so I think to me it's like there is now one that exists, and there are definitely issues in it. One because, of course, it's very much still the loudest voices in it are still Zionist voices, for example. But I would
yeah.
say
Although it's sort of like, I don't know. I feel like it's a one of the sad. I don't like. This might be oh my gosh! I'm about to give the hottest take.
oh, is this gonna be a very spicy Lucy take?
Yes, although some people might just see it as a cold take because whenever I say I'm gonna give a hot take, people just say that it's a cold take. So
Okay.
hello Sukhoi. So my hot take is that I think that the Zionist domination, to me personally, feels like this also a sad aftermath, sort of remnant of the Second World War and the Shoah.
No, I agree with you. I mean, that's why I think that someone like Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, where he talks about how Zionists weaponize anti Semitism to, for example, launder the state of Israel's, genocidal crimes against Palestinians, like, and that's something that we still see to this day, like, right, like with RFK
Yeah.
Jr., right, that just happened, where it's like, oh, but
And like the paper which I read, which like was one of the most painful papers which I read about the groups that like even went as far as to cooperate with the Nazis and were more busy fighting the British in Palestine than recognizing or paying any attention to the Shoah happening in Poland.
right, and also the article, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but the article of the
Not yet.
but it essentially was like the organization for like Hebrew. I don't want to. I don't. I the way how I was about to
Yes,
say it.
I saw a bit of it. Yes, I
Yeah,
saw a bit of it.
yeah. Like I just realized that it could be taken a really. I want to make sure that I'm saying it correctly because I don't want to misattribute it. But
Mm-hmm.
it was just let me see it really quick. Um, yes, it was the Army for the Defense of the Hebrew Language. Um, and so that existed during the time that there was this kind of language debate, right? The Sprachekrieg, as it was also called for some people, because and it initially started off as a discussion of, are the Jewish people in Palestine, if they are going to found institutions, right? Are they going to found it based on what language? And once again, this brings us back to the fact that Yiddish was once at one point also discounted from even the side that was anti-Hebrew, right? Because there was a side that was anti-Hebrew, but that was pro-German, right, in the sense of pro-German language. So like
Right.
when the Technion first opened, because an institution of learning first started prior to the foundation of the State of Israel. Hence why Albert Einstein was on its. Or is it Albert Einstein or is it Hebrew University of Jerusalem? Anyway, I might be getting them confused, but all I know is that one of them had Albert Einstein on their like founding faculty board, but because it was founded prior to the State of Israel being founded. But the point being that you have you have this this debate already happening where
Yeah.
on one
Of
hand
course.
you have the German speaking Jewish people
Can
saying,
can you say in what years the debate was happening exactly?
oh, this would have been in the 1920s.
Right. Because I want to sort of add a little caveat to the debate, if that's
Yeah, sure, please do.
from from my, because the like, to make it clear, the anti-Hebrew side, quote unquote, right? Like, it's important to remember that to the broader Yiddish speaking population, like a vast, huge group of Yiddish speakers, like the anti-Hebrew position wasn't an anti-Hebrew position because it wasn't we're against Hebrew. It was we are against using Hebrew in this context, because
Yes.
Hebrew was still used. Hebrew was still used in religion,
Right,
etc.
right.
It was an important part of everything. So it wasn't it, as like calling it an anti-Hebrew position might be very misleading.
Right. Yes. Yes.
I
Exactly.
think.
And yes, I understand that. And so I guess the one way to call them would be would be the I guess reconstructionist one what is one term they have used, but I don't think that's used technically anymore in historical literature. I think well, essentially like the pro Eliezer ben Yehuda group, right? Like, and essentially there was a foundational Zionism that came with that, right? Was that they wanted to take and this is kind of like the story that Israel will sort of sell, right, in its propaganda, that it's like, oh, we revived a dead language, but it wasn't dead,
It
so to,
wasn't dead. It
right.
was alive very much.
But it was dead in the sense that it was a liturgical language, but
Yeah.
it still informed. I mean, even the Jewish languages, like for example, like in Ladino, we say Mazel Buena, right, for good luck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like
Yeah.
technically speaking, Mazel Tov means good luck, technically speaking, but it's also now it's understood as a celebratory thing. But things like that, right? Or one Shabbat, right? Or good Shabbos, right? In Yiddish, right? So when when this is happening, there is the Ben Yehuda camp, and again, these were Zionists who wanted to again revive, right? I guess one way to call them is the revivalists, right? Or at least the supposed
Yeah.
revivalists. And they wanted to make it so that by force, people had to speak Hebrew. All Jewish people had to speak Hebrew, and this actually happened, where Eliezer ben Yehuda forced all of his wife and all of their servants, right? Because he was rather wealthy, to when he lived in Palestine, and when he was doing the whole, like, he wasn't the only person that did that. Although again, the propaganda like to focus on him, but anyway, the point being that he raised his son, right, his firstborn son, so that everybody in the house had to speak to him in Hebrew, right? And again, they didn't speak Hebrew at first, because he and his wife were Russian Jews, and most of their servants were also Russian, and I guess would also be, I guess now also Ukrainian Jews as well. And so when so then the story goes, right, and I think the story is very telling, is that, again, this is forced upon the child. So, like, when the child goes
Yeah.
out, right, no, he doesn't understand anybody, but when he's at home, they only speak to him in Hebrew. But one day, he finds out that, or one day he hears, Eliezer ben Yehuda hears that that the mom, or right, his wife, is singing to the child a Yiddish lullaby, right? And it might have even been a Russian lullaby. It doesn't really matter. But the point being that he went there and started yelling at her, right, like arguing with her, and that the little
Right.
boy starts saying "die, die, die," which means in Hebrew means to stop. Die means like halt, stop, arrest. That type of, like, stop it.
Yeah.
And so that's when he begins to this whole propaganda about this, like, see, I made the first native speaker of Hebrew in the past 2,000 years. It's my son. But it essentially
Yeah.
was through what essentially is child abuse. I mean, now we would recognize
Yeah.
it as child abuse, but in Israel they see that as this kind of like quirky little story of. But that's
like-
essentially what they wanted to do en masse.
I think we've said it a lot of times, but like one of the, I would say, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but one of the greatest writers was sort of very, not seen very favorably by Israel,
Right. Right.
because of I think that's a very nice photo, by the way. I think that's a
Yes,
really
yes,
nice
and
photograph.
another thing is that even when he was in America, he lived at a time when in America there still was such a thing as Yiddish theater, right? That there was still the Lower East Side, right? There were still all of these things that allowed for example, a lot of famous Hollywood actors and actresses to get their start. I mean, Shakespeare, for example, initially, right, when they first made the musical, what is now called West Side Story, for example, they initially were going to call it East Side Story, and it was going to be between Jewish gangs and I think Irish gangs, I believe, if I remember correctly. Where West Side Story is between Puerto Rican and white gangs, right? And so initially that's how it was going to start. It was going to be with Jewish characters, but they changed it because then the Lower East Side, because after the war, a whole bunch of stuff happened, right? All these policies that were, one, anti-immigrant, two, and well, first before that anti-black, and then also anti-immigrant, to the whole idea of urban blight, etc. But anyway, going back to Israel and the whole language thing, yes, the people that wanted German to be the Nationalsprache, right, the national language, were the ones who were also the ones writing all of the books. Like, I mean, to say that they were the ones who, like, for example, Herzl only wrote in German. Like, he wrote Der Judenstaat in German. I mean, it's in German. He wrote Als Neuland. It's in German, right? And so it's always been that or historically rather, that's to say, and even today I would still argue, is that the ruling is that the bourgeois the bourgeois group of people that founded the Zionist movement, right? Hence why Herzl does say the Jews are a bourgeois people, because that's him saying the Jews have become a bourgeois people like everybody else. Which isn't true, right? That I mean, again,
which is like, there are a few things to like sort of,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, like, for example, like, and it sort of touches upon the cultural aspect. It touches upon the aspect of Jewish people not acting faster. It was touched upon in the article of Tursky, the survival
Yeah.
of Auschwitz, that I often quote,
yes,
that there has been this culturally deeply ingrained idea, which interestingly enough Israel stands in total opposition of, that Jewish people do not need to be the big players on the board, that the Jewish community does not actually need to sort of be the movers, that Jewish people have their own way of living that does not entail sort of sort of extending force upon others, and that even in this war situation in the middle of the Shoah, that the best thing was to endure and to survive,
Mm-hmm.
rather than to try to exercise force.
Right. And that's where things like the Ha'ava agreement come into play, right? Because that shows the mentality of the Zionists in Palestine during the Second World War, where they were willing to essentially, literally, give up money to the Nazis in exchange for, bourgeois, the Jewish bourgeois, members of the Jewish bourgeoisie, right, to move over to Palestine. So that way, but resigning everybody else that was a proletarian, peasant, etc., to their fates, right? And so, and indeed, even so, like in this debate in the 20s, and even before that, like even at the turn of the century, because of course German was the language of science and such at the time, right? Like that was the language. Like at that point, that was the most often said it was the most educated population on the planet, right? The most universities, etc., etc. But the point
Mm-hmm.
being that is that when they were having this discussion, the Germanists, I guess, is that they wanted the language of instruction and the language of the country to be German, because they saw it as one, Zionism was developed, right, was thought up, and it was
Right.
philosophically, ideologically in Germany, in German-speaking lands, because
Right.
Herzl was from Austria-Hungary, but um, and then another thing too is that they took a lot of elements of Prussian nationalism, in particular, and then later German nationalism into account when they started to think of how to create Jewish nationalism, which to me is still a very strange thing to think about. But regardless, so the people that were the Yiddishists, right? Most of
Mm-hmm.
were a very small minority, and it's that they said, and they weren't even just necessarily Yiddishists, but they were one group was the ultra orthodox, the Haredim, who said Hebrew, biblical Hebrew is a holy language. It's Lashon HaKodesh, right? The holy tongue, and we should not use it as a Lashon Ha'am, right? And that the reason why Hashem had caused us to have the Lashon Ha'am, Lashon HaKodesh, was because this was something special for, right? It's something special for God, and for again, for liturgical purposes, and the
Mm-hmm.
Zionist movement in particular that were pro Hebrew. They were the ones that said, no, we need to have everything be done only in Hebrew, and force everybody to stop
Right.
exercising their own identities, right, and to instead this identity that we are going to create here, the whole idea of the new Jew, right, is and this
That is a term that I'm sort of familiar with. It
yes,
criticized the old Jew as which is interesting. Maybe you can sort of either sort of correct me if I'm wrong on this or not. But first, we have a bit of a pushback in the chat, if
yeah,
you're interested. First from Sukhoi, my half of exile mentor, soon to be. That's such a weird thing to say, because that's like saying Irish Americans have become bourgeois just because there are few examples of affluent and wealthy Irish people in the US. But you're talking about an ethnic category, and economic status doesn't manifest neatly along these lines. And the second one is from Sashi. That just sounds like blaming Zionists for the Nazis. I don't know how I feel about the characterization of that situation.
I want to make it very clear that when I'm talking about the Ha'avaha agreement, I'm talking about one singular instance. I'm not talking about the whole Shoah. I'm not that. I'm not. I want to
Yeah.
make that very clear. So I apologize if that's what that seemed like. I'm just saying that in this one instance, there were the people who eventually became the ruling, governing uh, uh, board, essentially, of what eventually became the state of Israel, that were willing to do such an agreement with the Nazis. But they weren't willing to do it to save, proletarian Jewish people or peasant Jewish people. No, they only did it for these particular people. And anyway, but again, that's I
There's
think that that's kind of besides the point. Like again, I'm not saying that the Zionists caused this. That's obviously not true. But what I'm saying is that they is that particular group and that particular time didn't see the greater harm that was happening to the Jewish people as necessary to say address. Instead, they cared more for a very short term thing for that one instance that I'm talking about, the Ha'avaha agreement. Um, and then the first thing about the bourgeois people, right? Like, yes, like I understand what people are saying, that people are saying it's a class thing. But the whole point is that nationalism, as we know it now, is bourgeois nationalism, right? Like that's why people that say like, oh, why is it that, for example, in imperialist countries, why isn't their patriotism slash nationalism good? And it's like because it's bourgeois nationalism, not proletarian nationalism, right? It's not liberatory. It's used as a pretense to then oppress, right? And so that's what Herzl and other people. I mean, in fact, that is what's happening in Israel. I mean, that is what ended up happening, right?
right. You
Um,
have a few other
yeah,
sort of build-ups on, well, how much did the Nazis have in deciding who is included in that agreement?
I that I off the top of my head, I don't know. I just
Because
know.
I know that it was like I read a thing on that whole agreement, how it was sort of. Because keep in mind that it was an agreement that was sort of the Nazis sort of observed the Zionist movement and saw it as a tool to be used, and it's
Exactly.
at the end of the day, it is worth acknowledging that no matter how much the Nazis had to decide who was included in the agreement, the Zionist movement in Germany did take Nazis upon the proposal for
Yeah,
the agreement.
and not only that, and of course I've mentioned this before, and I don't really like bringing it up because, again, I don't want it to be understood as, therefore, this caused this, because that's what the author of this horrendous book, Mein Kampf, adds it in there to kind of say, like, oh, well, they are the ones that told me, right? Like, they themselves, is that in Mein Kampf, Hitler says, it was the Zionists who told me the Jewish people can never assimilate and can never be part of any other nation but their own, right? And so, again, that's why I think that in this discussion of bourgeois nationalism, right? That's why I'm saying that when Herzl says, when he writes in Der Judenstaat, right? When he writes the Jews are a bourgeois people, he means that they have reached bourgeois nationalism and that therefore they deserve a nation state as one akin to France being the nation state of the French, right? The Netherlands being the nation state of the Dutch, Germany being the nation state of the Germans, etc. And so that is the idea that is going into is the idea behind that. It's not. It's the idea of nationalism itself is tied
Yes,
into political economy, not the other way around. Not into.
which the idea of the Jewish community becoming like a nation with a nation state is un- unfortunate to me. That's like the situation, the world situation was a bit different before World War II, and the situation was shaping up to be a bit different than it is now, let me just say.
Oh
And
yeah.
there are a lot of rabbis that corroborated on the idea that it's not, um, it's like there were, I've seen in very many interesting books how the rabbis were saying that in the future, like the Jewish community, like the word Jewry, as the rabbi has phrased it, even though for many people this phrasing has negative connotations,
Yes.
um, that it will be led by the Polish community because it's the most sort of like energetic. It keeps the tradition, but also the freedoms like that Jewish people in the U.S. enjoy, and hence it would sort of lead like a very prosperous and wonderful future for Jewish people. And we all know what happened then,
Right,
you know.
right, and in fact, that's why, like, unfortunately, this film I recently found out was, is not necessarily a good watch because it's directed by Roman Polanski.
Mm,
But the pianist, right, is a very from again when I watched it, this was a long time ago, and I was much younger when I watched it, and I didn't even know like anything about the this was when I was a child because it's very old. It's like from 2004 or something like that. And anyway,
okay.
so that's not the point, but the point being that like it portrays a Polish Jewish family that you can tell no difference from them from any other Polish family, right? It's like they,
Which, oh my gosh, that's a whole topic that was touched upon on the conference,
yeah,
which actually touches upon the cultural, and of course I will read you the Karasu comments because they are very interesting and enlightening as always.
yeah,
I
of
think
course,
they add to the discussion. But first I will say that there was this whole discussion and it does touch upon the cultural, the cultural nature of Jewishness because the historian who actually specializes in genocide said that in many ways the fact that the Shoah became this, it does not belong to the Jewish people just anymore. And so it was so ingrained in human experience that sort of that that it's that sort of Jewish people lost control over how it's talked about, over the whole discourse, etc., about the Shoah, right? And the historian gives example of movies like the Anne Frank Diary, the pianist, I think was also, and the aspect of not being able to tell apart the families, that the historian said that the Jewishness was so excised from
yeah,
these works that there was no mention of Jewishness and no elements of Jewish culture in it, that it basically stopped being Jewish in the slightest in the process, you
right,
know?
and I think to me like, and that's a very good point to make, and I think that I guess on one hand there is the point that that of course well one I guess is I would say that yes, there is a desire to universalize, right, the experience of Hashoah, especially because, of course, when they say, for example, when most people think of the number of the people who were, genocided, they think of 6 million. But and even that's a low estimate now. Now it's actually, it's by historians have been estimated to be higher than that. But in school, that's typically in America. That's typically what people are taught. But that's just
Mm-hmm.
the amount of Jewish people, right? Like the whole entire thing is now estimated to have been around 17 to 20 million people, right? And so there's always been this interesting discussion by people who want to discuss the Holocaust of whether whether there should be a discussion of it from the side of um, well, how should I word this? because I don't want to word it in the way how I heard it at a conference actually, is that one of them said as just the average everyday family, or as the Jewish everyday family, right? The one reason why is that they wanted to. I guess one of the things was that like in the early 2000s, that was apparently a big deal to like portray the Jewish people, and I don't know if this is necessarily true or not, but because it's their depiction in fiction. It's not their depiction in like documentaries, etc. Right? It's this desire to want to universalize the Jewish people so that they're just, as it were, like any other people. But that means flattening Jewish culture and flattening Jewish identity to make it into like essentially they're just Americans, but they wear kippahs, right? Essentially like Ben Shapiro, like in a way. But like I mean, but worse, where that will never it will never be brought up at all, right? And for like again like the pianist, it's like you don't, as it were, know that they're Jewish until they say, why don't blah blah, like until they themselves say it, right? Like they have to say that they're Jewish for them to, as it were, come into existence. And that's actually what's interesting to me about it. I mean, not the film itself, but like the idea that there is this view that either you universalize Jewish experience, right? So that way, because the argument is for, on one hand, intelligibility, but that's actually not from academics or even from Jewish studies and even Jewish artists. That's usually from other people who want to, who think that, like, for marketing purpose, I mean, I don't know how else to word it, but like that would benefit.
Well, it's sort of. I have this. I still have it in in my notes. From the conference. There we go. Have you seen? Actually, have you seen my whole segment about this? And I talked about it.
Yeah, I saw both.
You can repeat it here. Yeah, it's like I think those points are pretty important. Holocaust as a political success,
Mm-hmm.
Because victims usually are powerless, and we are an exception to that rule. And there's this, because the Holocaust, you could say, was a political success in the sense that it is basically, when you think the word genocide, you usually your first thought is of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
And it became ingrained in human consciousness it almost became like this human, like a symbol of human experience. And where is this? I have here my I think it comes later. Yes, there you go. Are you still here?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I was just getting my own book to start quoting from as well.
The price of the political success. There is a price to the success of the Holocaust. The price is that the memory of the Shoah is no longer Jewish. It became a universal metaphor for universal suffering. And so this is like, it was like the historical because there was a person at some point that said that it was a universal thing, and the historian said that it is important to remember that it was done to Jewish people, and that the Jewishness was what's central to the deed,
Mm-hmm.
And after the genocide, we have been accepted as human.
Um,
And for stories to become universal, groups lose control of the story. And an example was given that was completely outside of the Shoah. No one asks the Native Americans of their opinion on how their suffering should be depicted, you know?
right. Well, yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
yes,
I mean, for one thing, it's technically still ongoing, so there's that, I suppose. But
yeah. And I'll also read to you because I think it's long. It has been long for me to not read, and I think it's really, I think it's valuable to read this out loud.
sure, go right ahead.
I think in a sense, sorry? Yeah?
Hmm.
Sorry? You said
No,
something?
I said yeah. Go right ahead. I was just-
Okay. I think this is from Karasu Kafka. I think in a sense Hungarian nationalism might have more influence than Prussian, with the other heralds having influenced with Austro-Hungary history. And this nationalism had been sadly very ethnocentric. The other heralds born in passed after 1848-49, an era which were brutal and important how Hungarian identity forget targeting other minorities. The reason Theodor Herz had been saying that because the anti-Semitism was quite prominent in Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary had a straight-up anti-Semite party in parliament at 1870s. Budapest's Neolog Jewish movement was pretty interesting and very open-minded, and still is. As such, not sure what Zionist group, but probably you're reacting to Shakespeare. Like we are referencing when we were discussing the whole thing, we were referencing the Zionist groups that existed within Germany that were basically elevated by the Nazi Party to
Mhm.
certain roles.
Right, right. And
And
I.
then Sashi also, I'm sorry to
Oh no, no, go ahead. Keep
one
going.
last thing. Didn't Simon Weston lie about the number of non-Jewish people? He was afraid no one would care. I mean, not lie, but just picked a number and went with it. Of, uh, or for example, the difference between original version of Night Code and The World Remained Silent was too um, vengeful for a larger audience.
Um.
This was the question by Sashi, the later one.
Oh, okay. I see. I see. Well, like, well, again, one, I would say that I don't know, like, it's interestingly enough, it's a very complicated question to say that one. I mean, I wouldn't work. Maybe this is my own personal view, but I wouldn't word it as quote unquote a political success, right? Like, I don't think that any Jewish person, let alone millions of Jewish people, right, um, being genocided of all the Jewish Sephardic, Ashkenazi, right, Hasidic, etc. Right, like
Always keep in mind because that might be me not sufficiently translating it. When the historian, who is of course also Jewish, at the end of the day, like he literally said that he wrote a whole book called "The Final Solutions" about the genociders and their work. He said that he physically could not write about the Shoah because it was too personal to him. That he could not be as dry and analytical about the Shoah because it was just too close
right,
to
right,
home experience. And when he says that it's a political success, he doesn't mean the genocide itself. He
no, no,
means how the genocide was accepted as genocide by the worldwide republic. Like when it comes to, for example, the Native American situation, you have a large body of people that will say, well, is it really a genocide? Like, well, let's discuss this. It's not like it was a success in this sort of that it was widely accepted and not disputed, and sort of it became a non-negotiable thing. Well, there are of course some fringe actors that will dispute it nevertheless, but
right.
overall it's basically like it's just a non-negotiable thing on whether or not it happened and how horrible it was.
Right. Well, if you don't mind, this isn't in English. So I don't know. Is it alright if I read it first in Spanish and then translate it out, or do you want to just
Oh, yeah, of
translate?
course. Yeah, I think that would be best.
Okay, so this is the book Auschwitz por herencia sobre un buen uso de la memoria by he's also Jewish, Georges Bensoussan, and the book is Auschwitz by inheritance on the good on the correct use of memory. Um, and so in this part here in the first chapter called Las trampas de la memoria, like the traps of memory, he begins with para el mundo judío la Segunda Guerra Mundial es el lugar de una memoria insoportable, inevitable y difícil de transmitir. Nadie combatió para salvar a los judíos. Ningún campo fue liberado siguiendo órdenes. Todos lo fueron por azar, porque estaban situados sobre el camino del avance de las tropas. So, for the Jewish world, the Second World War is a place is a site of an insupportable, inevitable, and difficult memory to transmit. Because nobody fought to save the Jews. No concentration camp was liberated following orders. They were all done by chance because they were situated on the line of advance of the marching troops. And then he continues. Esa memoria difícil remita a la vergüenza del recuerdo. ¿Cómo olvidar el hecho de haber sido reducidos a esa impotencia y a esa otra imborrable de la humillación? ¿Quién había sucumbido a la tortura y ya no puede sentirse como en casa en el mundo? La vergüenza de la destrucción es imborrable. Por eso esa memoria remite también a la culpabilidad del superviviente y a la vergüenza de pertenecer a la misma especie que el asesino, a la manera de Primo Levi. So this part he says, this difficult memory remits the shame of remembering. How could one forget the fact of having been reduced to such impotence? And in another sense, unerasable, or that's one way to put it, of humiliation, to have succumbed to the torture, cannot be felt. Who has not succumbed to the torture that it is no longer possible to feel at home in the world? The shame of the destruction is ineffaceable. But that memory remits also to the culpability of the survivor and the shame to pertain to the same species as the assassins, in the same way as Primo Levi states. One feels culpable for being human because it was humans who built Auschwitz. And I think, to me, that's where I think Georges Bensoussan's interesting understanding of, like, particularly the first part where he's talking about, like, none of the concentration camps were liberated because they came to save us, right? It's just because they were places where there was lots of German troops and lots of, munitions, etc. Like, that's why they did that, right? And so in that sense, it's like, it's really true that that's why I think he goes into the idea of shame, right? And he talks about a lot of people who couldn't support, continuing on, so to speak, after they were rescued years later. But but the point being that how can, like, for the Jewish people, how is it that we can have this memory, right, or this site of memory, that is so one. It's inevitable for us to bring it up. Like it's one of the unfortunately one of the moments that now defines the Jewish people to some extent. Although I believe Georges believes it defines us completely now, or at least completely in the sense of in the modern sense. Like if when people think of a Jewish person, they also think of that. So I guess that also goes to what the speaker at the conference said as well, and the fact that also.
Oh, to be fair, the conference was dedicated to the subject as well.
Right. Also, hi Buffy. Hi Buffy. And also the shame of having been reduced to such powerlessness. Right. Like the fact that like the Warsaw Ghetto was a place of powerlessness. Auschwitz was a place of power. The gas chambers were a place of powerlessness, and that the shame of the destruction itself of the Jewish people is also shameful, right? But also upon the Jewish people. That is why it also transmits to some people survivor's guilt, right? And so
there were people that survived and just sort of could not there were people that survived and later ended up taking their own life because they just could not grapple with.
So I guess to me in this light, right, of what we were just talking about, how do we take into account something like this aspect, right? Like when we take into the account that, as much as, internet, Marxist Leninists love to be like, oh, Joseph Stalin, essentially order which he didn't. Again, we know this, did not order the liberation of Auschwitz. They just happened, the Red Army just happened to have been nearby, so to speak.
It was on the way to Berlin.
Yeah, it was on the way to Berlin, right? And it was, and it's by Krakow as well, which is important, But anyway, but the point being, it's like when you put it in this way, the fact that if they could have, as it were, missed us, right? They could have just passed us by. That impotence, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, because I will read the chat in a bit because the chat has many interesting things to say and insightful in my opinion. But like the historian also, because I think the historian also sort of was talking about a certain balance and a dilemma that happens because of on the one hand you have the erasure of the Jewishness, right? But on the other hand, the historian also said, on the other hand, I believe that the universalness is also kind of important because the never again sort of call that was created, right? The never again is basically, it's not a single message of never again the Holocaust. It's like, it means many different things. It means never again become victims, never again be a perpetrator, never again be a someone that just stands by. And like the universal message of the never again, that we should never, like as a wider sort of universal humanity, we should never allow things like that to happen ever again. And hence the title of the whole conference, The Wasted Lessons of the Holocaust.
Right. And if I may just add one quick thing, is that for another genocide that also happened, that is also has many denialists, in fact, one of which was recently the ruler of the country in which it was committed, and where they actually had campos de concentración, they actually called them like in America they'll call them detention camps, but
of course, keep in mind that as well, concentration camps and death camps are also two a bit different things.
Right, exactly. Some of them were labor camps that,
people still died in those labor camps, but they were not designed to kill people.
Right. Like how Auschwitz was first designed as a labor camp, but once Birkenau was built, then that was where anyway. I don't want to get too much into it anyway, but the whole point being that, but these were, concentration camps, but in the sense of like torture / death, etc. And that is in Argentina. They had a document that was brought out after the end of the last dictatorship, which was from 1976 to 1983, and it's called Nunca Más. literally never again.
Mm.
And it itself came, and in some ways I feel like it, in a way, it came out too soon, because they also came out with a movie called The Official Story, or the, well, in Spanish, historia can mean, well, I mean, I think this is common in most languages, is that history and story can mean, right, whereas story in English means, typically, is resigned to the idea of fiction, right? Um, but anyway, the official history, right, or the official story came out like really soon after the dictatorship. So there have been some people that have viewed it as a kind of like, oh, it kind of alleviates, I guess, or whitewashes the perpetrator's guilt, right? And yes, and so that's another example where, there was targeting of Jewish people, for example, in the Argentine example, but also, again, like, you have this where that phrase, right, the is used again, right, like never again. It means also this time, but of course,
Yeah.
in the same sense that it only focuses on Argentina, it doesn't look at the other dictatorships, right? Like, it doesn't look at Brazil or Paraguay or Mexico, or what I mean, like, that also had these supposed quote unquote dirty wars, right? But also, like I said, Nunca Más is a document that actually goes. It's like a document, brought by people, written to sort of document what occurred, right, and say never again. And then there was another
Yeah.
thing called Never Again, where they interviewed people that had survived, right, in the concentration camps they had in Argentina. And that was also called Nunca Más. So yes, in
Yeah.
that sense, yeah, like, it is at once universal and also, as it were, specific to,
And of
right?
course, there's also a very sarcastic. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. I'm gonna paraphrase it, but there's also a very sarcastic, but bitterly sarcastic sort of interpretation of the "never again." I'm not sure if you know it.
Um,
It's the "never again will the Jewish people be um, murdered by Nazi Germany in the 1940s."
oh, yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
Well, I mean,
that's a
that's definitely how a lot of edgy, sort of quote unquote, people online like to think of it. But that's for sure. I will say that. You will meet that kind of sardonic way of thinking in that sense, for sure.
Yeah, and I will read a bit of, maybe I'll just give a bit of a trivia before I read the chat, because we talked about the whole anti-Yiddish sentiment, and we have to keep in mind we use the term Shoah now, but at the very beginning, the survivors of the Holocaust had a Yiddish term for the event, which escapes my mind right now, but it went
Churban.
out of use in the favor of the term Shah.
Yeah, it's a the churban, the sacrifice, or the, yeah,
Right,
the destruction,
you know,
etc. Yeah, churban.
which is also sort of worth having like at the back of your mind, that there was actually like this initial term that was used and was sort of, I'm not sure about the circumstances, but it was sort of like set aside, for a different term.
Well, one reason why, if I may just quickly bring up that, is one reason why is because then, there was the building of Yad Vashem in what is now the state of Israel, right, in Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and that is why, when they became the largest, the world, or the internet, I think they're called the World Holocaust Memorial, right, Museum, that because it is in Hebrew. Yeah, I mean, even the name of the museum is because it's a reference to, to what the Germans would do to the Jewish people. Like, they would say, "Give us your hand," so that way they could tattoo you, and your name. So then you would literally give them your name, and then you would just be reduced to a number, right, which was tattooed on your hand, right, or on your arm, rather, I should
Yeah.
say. But the point being that, is that when that happens, then Israel and the United States become the two places where there are Holocaust studies, right? Like, and so then there's these two terms, right? The Holocaust, which is what it's used in English, and then the Hashoah, which is what's used in Israel, where and the Yiddish term, because for one reason, again, like I mentioned, Yiddish was banned after the foundation of the state of Israel.
Yeah.
They never let it be called Hurban, the Horban, and
Yeah, I find that a bit sad because it was the term that was used by the actual survivors,
yeah, I mean,
by the people that actually survived.
yes, and in fact, one of the first documents that I can remember was that there was poetry written in Auschwitz, and one of them was called Die Horban. Like, it's literally, like, it's
Yeah.
self-referential, like it's talking about, like, and it, but they didn't know that. I mean, it's not as though they knew the other terms, right? It's not like, oh, they already knew that they were going to use the term Holocaust in English, and it's that they were describing their own situation as they knew it and calling it
Yeah,
Horban.
and I sort of think that it's that this sort of thing should be preserved more, like the terms,
Yeah,
the
I
way
completely
that
agree.
the actual people that lived through it used, and I think that's I think there's like something, to say the least, lost when we don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, during the conference, the Holocaust, it was titled the Wasted Lessons of the Holocaust, but almost 99 or more, the term Holocaust was not actually used. The term used was the Shoah throughout the conference.
Right.
Right. So fake Alec Parker, the birthday person of the day, says, because it is fake Alec Parker's birthday.
Yes.
The world owes the Jewish people an apology for not coming to their aid and for letting anti-Semitism rise again. The world forgets how the Jewish people helped we, the people, and the working class. I have to say that there is a lot to be talked about historically on how Jewish people sort of found the idea of socialism and communism, like the actual, I'm not talking about the Soviet thing, but the ideas of both socialism and communism, of this more fair, equal, and just society that Jewish people, a lot of Jewish people found it very appealing and sort of dedicated themselves to working towards it. I think there's a lot to be said about it.
Right, and
even though it was twisted later for that term, Jewish Bolshevism,
Yeah,
etc.
Mm-hmm. No,
Like it was, yeah.
No, well, I was just gonna add on to that. In fact, that was the Europe at the time, right? Like those were socialism, communism. I mean, if you want to see them as separate, right? Right. Communism meaning, say,
They
more.
sort of are, because socialists and communists often clashed over like very fundamental things,
like the nature of the state, of all those things, right? But so anyway, but like in general, but then you also have Bundists, all of this stuff, and so this was all of the discussion, and Zionists were just one small part of that, and only now have they become this like this hegemonic thing, overrepresented. Yes, exactly. Whereas before they were a very tiny minority. I mean, even in the spaces that did not, as it were, go into the other categories, right? Like in the religious world, it was Zionism was always seen as. It's only very recently that you have something like Chabad, Lubavitch, where they are pro-Zionist. Because
historically. Sorry to interject. Historically, the Jewish community was not very happy with things like nation states forming and sort of these hard nation lines forming.
No.
Like I think I don't know. I think there's a reason why the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is still to this day referenced as the Golden Age.
Well,
You know?
if I may also add, I mean, like, this is another thing that I would say is important. Every single time that you have the creation of those hard lines, that's when you get persecution of the Jewish people, because
Yes.
we are always, and in
Yeah.
fact this is true in the Middle Ages. Like, this is in the book, The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages, by Geraldine Heng, a very wonderful critical race scholar historian, is that the Jewish people are the people that nations have used to define themselves against in Europe, and whether it happened earlier on or later on is just a question of, like, when the idea and what ideas, right, led them to create those hard lines, right. But that's why, like, even now, for example, like that's why, for example, when you that's one reason why I think that things like, for example, Spain under Islamic rule, where it was a caliphate, that is to say that it was or an emirate, right, where it wasn't.
Like are you referring to the golden age? Of,
Yeah, yes,
like another golden age.
yes, the other golden age, the one in Iberia for Sephardic Jews. But I mean, there were other Jews from all over too. But and then also the golden age in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Yeah, and of course that was also the Spanish period was also the golden age for Islam.
Right. Yes. Yes. And so, and I think, to me, that those two spaces, which just happen to be on opposite ends of Europe, you know, you know, are two spaces where they weren't nation states, right? And as soon as
Yeah, exactly.
and as soon as you do get them, then that's when you get that's when again the question about the Jewish people becomes, and also Ben Susan talks about that too more in this book. It's like, then that becomes the question of that nation
Yeah.
state, because then it's like,
Well,
well, like, we know what our national identity is, but what about this group, right? And it's always
Yeah.
the Jewish people that's used against. So
It is, yeah. I will add also that the creation of hard nation lines necessitates, by very definition, the creation of the in-group and the outsiders. It's sort of by design. Well, not almost, it is by design. And to add from the chat, because I would like to like brag a bit, my chat might be small, but it's very nice. Jewish people have done more for socialism and communism than Marxist-Leninists ever have, which I will definitely agree with. Karasu says, to be fair, any other group could be used as well, such as Slavic people described similarly as today Great Replacement in the 19th century in Hungary. Yeah, I mean, there's a wider point to be made about how nation states sort of created this manufactured otherization of many different groups of people that might have lived in the area even for hundreds of years. Like, of course, one of the most well-known examples is the Armenian genocide, right? Like, which was a direct result of the rise of the nation state of Turkey.
By the Young Turks, of all people.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I am aware. But yes, Jewish or Romani people are easily targeted because of the differences perceived. Yes, and there's also a lot of the to be said about the intergenerational solidarity between Jewish people and the Roma people.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And even though they considered now one ethnicity, if it went through an erasure of distinct identities to reach to be what is considered Hungarian. Yeah, that is usually what happens, the flattening. It's like what a Japanese person that I know, who also is a developer, worked on Kingdom Hearts 3.
Oh wow.
Said that Japan is sort of considered this mono-ethnical place, when Japan is basically a collection of 3 different peoples that are mashed into one, and everybody in Japan pretends that it's a one group.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's another thing too. It's like in America, right? Like, the whiteness as it exists in America, right? With the people it's assimilated into whiteness, they wouldn't be seen as like. And this is another thing too. Like, someone actually said this on Twitter recently. Well, someone posted like that. Someone had talked about like they did like a post about like a long thing about it where they said that they were German American, and when they went to Germany, like that they didn't feel at home, right? That like, oh, I don't like the language, I don't like the food, I don't like the it's like that.
Yeah.
And it's that like that the idea of the hyphened American for that people often try to use as like a, oh well, back in the day this group was seen as this in this way, but no one alive now has ever experienced that discrimination. In fact,
Yeah, and there's also this whole group for Polish Americans,
yes,
and there
yes.
was this famous post. Oh gosh, I hope I can find it. This famous post of a person that basically was like, uh, mm, that said, I went to Poland, to Krakow. Everybody was great, the food was great, but nobody appreciated my Polish heritage. Everybody just treated me like as if there was no big deal. I'm never going back there
Yeah,
again.
yeah. It's essentially the same thing. It's the same thing. It's like oh like or the other way is like they don't see me as Polish. They see me as an American, right? Like that's another version of the story too, where it's like oh they don't appreciate my Polishness because they just see me as an American anyway.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so
and
like
and, pe- and people were just like and responding, well, what did you expect, a red carpet? Like, did you expect this over exaggerated whole parade thing to happen because you
like at
were
last
Polish?
the
You
chosen
know,
one has returned.
through to the womb.
Right, and I think to me that is something that with the assimilated white, as they would like to think of themselves, because there is a sense where like the term ethnic means non-white, right? Like, and that's why when people say, "Oh, it's about culture." Well, one, I mean, even in older books, like in the racial formation of in the United States, which was in 1986, they already remarked that. People were using the term culture as another word to say race. So like when people say, "Oh, it's like I say about African American people," or like, "Oh, it's a cultural thing," they're just saying race. Like that, that's already been shown to be true. But anyway, that's besides the point. But yes, whereas like even the hegemonic whiteness in the United States, it still grapples with the question of whether Jews are to be totally accepted into that as well, right?
Yeah,
Because it's definitely seen as like more conditional than others, right? Like Italians, oh yeah, sure, they're in, whatever. Poles, they're in, right? Ukrainians, whatever, blah blah blah. But when it comes to the Jewish people, that's when again, because there is such a long legacy of anti-Semitism, and then before that, before anti-Semitism
yeah,
was developed as a way of thinking, anti-Judaism, right? That's where again
yeah.
you.
Although of course I will also tell during the conference B, and I sort of love these conferences, because you
Oh
can
yeah.
hear like many different things that even sometimes they are clashing, sometimes they're not, but they're all extremely interesting. Like one person said that they're sort of careful about the distinction of the old anti-Semitism and the new one, that the terms are that the like yes, there is the new aspect of nationalism, but also there are, and yeah, it is true that there are elements of the old that bleed into the new, which blurs the whole thing a bit.
Right, right, and in fact, one person that I cite a lot is Thomas Kuhn's book "Belonging and Genocide," where he's like, in order for like you cannot take away, and this is part of my own work as well. and I know I've told you this before, that like we should not see the Holocaust or the Horban, right, as an aberration, right? It was a one-time negative. It's a long trajectory of anti-Jewish,
Yeah.
anti-Semitic hatred. It's
Yes,
just this.
definitely. Yeah.
It's just that now it happened in the age of imperialist, industrialized capitalism, right? As opposed to say the other one, like the other one that comes to mind is, of course, the other one that I am currently looking at, right, is the Inquisitions that took place in the Mediterranean, in Italy, and in France and Spain. I mean, people tend to know the Spanish one best, or at least not best, but they tend to have heard it more. The Portuguese one, and then the ones that they had worldwide, because they were two worldwide empires. So like that was it at that stage of capitalism, right? And so again, like that's why I think that, yeah, Thomas Kuhn's book is like, people try to often, and this is true, especially in the United States, and this is something that even people that are call themselves very left leaning, etc., will still do, and I think that it's because of how it's taught in America, and that is
Yeah.
that
What will they do?
is that they will say, "Oh, Hitler was insane. Hitler was a maniac. Hitler, that he was a megalomaniac. He was blah blah blah." Like, they're literally giving reasons to act as though, right, there is no way that any quote unquote normal person could have ever have done this, right? Even though, like, for one, Hannah Arendt already spoke about this in the banal and Eichmann in Jerusalem, right,
Well,
on the banality of evil.
it is important to note, like, it leads to the hypotheticals: would you kill Hitler as a baby or something, which becomes sort of an irrelevant question, because the problem was the broader movement, not the individual. The
Right.
genocide was not committed by a individual who had much less control in the whole country
Right.
than people given credit to begin with.
Right.
It's a whole complicated topic on Hitler's rule being a delicate balance between a bunch of really powerful people that sort of fought against
Yeah,
one
yeah.
another, and
Yes.
Hitler basically just capitalized it to stay afloat
Right.
as the
Right.
boss.
And so yes, and I've talked about this on stream too. Like and it's very, I could go in depth, but I think instead the point I guess I'm trying to make is that like we can, like, when people try to make the nut again seem like an aberration, right? And that's what I mean, is like when they try to make this particular instance, right, seem so, again, like such an aberration beyond all, right, is that they forget, like, what about everybody else in the society who participated or collaborated,
Yeah.
or blah blah blah. And this comes into the question is, why were there other countries that were willing to collaborate
This is how you get the growing genocide problem in Poland, by the way.
Right, exactly. And so this is where, like, as a historian, like, one of the questions that has been worked on and has also been shown is like, well, it's not like when Romania decided to go on the side of the Nazis, like when they installed a government there, that suddenly now, because the Nazis had stepped foot in Romania, suddenly all of Romania became anti-Semitic. No, it's that there already was a long tradition of anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
one from the Eastern Orthodox Church, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like,
Yeah.
and so that was already there. The fact that they gave them the ability to do XYZ things, right, it doesn't make it
Yeah.
right, unique, right? And so
Exactly.
and so that's what he says in well, that's not what he argues.
This is important because it shows us that we have to tackle systems, not evil, satanic individuals.
Exactly.
And we're getting some really good interaction from the chat.
Oh, good.
Karasu says, this is important about the concept of whiteness. It is conditional and can be revoked at any time or incorporate groups at any time.
Right.
Which I think is absolutely correct.
Right.
Sashi says, this is a very interesting question to me. Is the Inquisition an example of political failure versus the Holocaust? I think this is a pretty interesting topic to tackle. I'm actually thinking if I shouldn't, because I will be having a talk with the historian at some point. He actually agreed to talk to me. He just said that he had a like over I don't know, I don't remember the exact number right now, over like 50 or something, like some crazy number of like final works and university to sort of go through
Oh
and
yeah, to
mark.
grade and yeah.
So he said he didn't have time, but I think we might be approaching a time when we'll, to contact him, and I think that might be an interesting question to ask him.
Right.
If the Inquisition could be an example of political failure versus the Holocaust
I
political.
mean, you definitely could put it like this.
Because like I don't think the Inquisition thing is as widely recognized. Definitely.
No. And not only that, but remember, like when Spain did it, for example, Spain didn't rescind the order of expelling all the Jewish people from all of the lands that because it technically still has colonies, like in Africa, like Ceuta and Melilla on the coast of northern Morocco, etc. And stuff like that. Is that
Well, I have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, because Carasso said it is more than that the later is the same as the earlier, just in that industrial level. I think I should explain because Carasso could have not been here, but yeah, like the success in the sense that the Shoah is like recognized as a horrible tragedy, basically universally at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you would talk about the Inquisition, I don't think it would meet with quite the same, with quite the same response, right?
Well,
you would have to get into it. You would have to start explaining why it was so horrible, what happened, etc.
Right. And in fact, that's one of the issues. Is like when I have brought it up to some people, they immediately bring up the joke from Monty Python about the nobody expects the, and it's like, do you realize, like, if someone were to say like nobody expects the Holocaust, you know what I mean, like that wouldn't be acceptable, but that's in essence what you're comparing it to, and I think to me it's like that is not a joke to me, right? Like when people bring that up, like that's not funny to me.
What is that funny, sir?
Well, it's part of a funny movie. I forget which one. If it's Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or Monty Python. It's a Monty Python movie, and in one of their like skits is the joke is nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, right? And what they do is like they like scared this little old lady or something, and they're like, confess your sins, like confess, and so they're making light of it, but I'm thinking no one would make fun in the same way of the interior of Auschwitz, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And
interestingly enough, the Spanish thing was like a whole big topic. Like it was a redeeming thing in the second day of the conference, which was full of Zionism, but like the topic of the forceful sort of this, on the one hand conversion, and on the other hand treating Jewish people as this group that might have converted but actually secretly still practices Judaism and is just pretending, it was a big topic at the conference. Yeah.
Well, yes, especially because on one hand there are many people who have lived, Jewish lives for centuries now. For example, there is a book that I recently I read the introduction to because usually in introductions of academic books it gives you a synopsis of what each chapter is about, and so I wanted to look at the chapter where it specifically is talking about specific inquisitors, right? Historically, after.
I think this, of course, sorry I really apologize, but of course there's the aspect of the thing in Spain being so powerful that it's just being it creeps up on us till today. That makes sense.
Yes.
The whole.
And so
I'm sorry for.
no. That was a point to make, and I think that that's fine. So yeah, so one of those things, those aspects, is that I was trying to find about specific inquisitors, because one of them, after 1571, when it's established in Mexico City, um, is that there is someone that they. So anyway, this is. I probably shouldn't even get too in depth because I don't want to. Yeah. Anyway, the point being that I was reading through it, and it says that at some point, like, Jewish people essentially just vanish off the face of the earth in Mexico, right? Until Ashkenazi Jews moved to Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then post-war. And I'm like, what are you talking? Like, that is not true. I mean, even rabbis that I know that are Orthodox and are everything that are Sephardic, because like even they have family that have been here since a long time ago, right, so to speak. And so as soon as I was reading that, I was like, that's another thing too, is like the very idea of this global inquisition happening, and it being so violent, it being so dangerous for people, and of course it requiring people to have to be in hiding constantly, right? And the fact that it wasn't resign, and in fact that the fact that Spain could do it, and it wasn't in anybody's interest to stop them, and Portugal to do it as well.
And a very important aspect that you sort of touched upon yesterday and maybe today, that there were people that had to later, and that was, I'm pretty sure, touched upon on the conference as well, that there were people that had to reconstruct their identities later, like their roots. They had to reconstruct it through the lens of the Inquisition.
Yes.
And that it sort of led to, which is inevitable, the fact that the nature of their identity became different than before.
Yes, it became seen by some people as different than before, in the sense that so I can elaborate on that.
I'm not even talking about from the outside perspective. I'm talking about from the insider's perspective.
Oh yes, for sure, sure, yes.
It has been just changed by that fact.
Right, because the Inquisition, again, like another thing that I guess is sort of difficult to sometimes discuss when we're talking about historical aspects, is that things that we now see as separate categories, right, weren't seen necessarily as that prior, right? Like the idea of being a quote-unquote homosexual, right? Like that is a modern thing that didn't exist before. Before, it was seen as acts that someone did, but it was not seen as an essence of a person, so to speak, right? And so in the same way, like at this point, right, that we're talking about during the Inquisition, which initially started in Rome and the Papal States, and the office still exists, the Holy Office. It's just now the Holy Office on the Propagation of the Faith, that's its new title, instead of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Is that it essentially is that back then this distinction between Jewish people and what we would now call religious practices, I guess, and even I guess maybe perhaps religious behaviors, were not seen as separate, right? And they weren't separate, right? In the same way that if you were Christian, even the way how you behave, and this is why I said, like, this is why something like washing your hands before eating food was seen as a tell that you were Jewish, because that was something that Christians did not do, right?
And of course there's that's a thing that I've been sort of discovering on the path to my heritage, when I visited the Shabbat dinners, and the sort of after the initial prayer, right? When everyone is asked to move, and you sort of, it's not sort of the literal washing of your hands, but you pour the
Yeah,
water 3 times
yeah,
on one hand, 3 times on, and say a quick prayer,
yeah.
which
The
is a very that's another thing that you could say. Yeah, it is rooted in religion, but it's I think it's from my personal perspective, I think it's sort of more than that now.
well, I
If that
mean,
makes sense.
well, it's interesting too because also like some people that are uh how should I put this? That are that try to explain how sh- like there are some people that will try to explain away the religiosity of XYZ thing, right? By saying, "Oh, this was done because of health reasons," or it's like, "Oh yes, and thank you so much for the shout out for that. Yes, please follow Lucy Hayes on Twitch and also on YouTube." Um,
On
so
everything.
on everything, yes,
I
exactly.
can give you a link if you want.
Yeah, sure. And
I
so
will link. But
and
yes.
and so
I mean, I don't think it's unfair to do sort of. Like, I think those things were often intertwined.
no, yeah,
Like
exactly.
those.
Right, exactly. It's like people have a tendency to do that now, right? Where they will try to be like, well, it makes sense that back then they would have wanted to do XYZ thing. But of course the explanations and the understandings were just different, right? Like it's not like Jewish people knew germ theory before anybody else knew germ theory, right?
Yeah.
It's rather that
Although there's not even germ theory. Like, there's like the one thing that is often explained is that, like, the kosher nature, right? Like the way the food is prepared, that there were, like, maybe that's total bogus, but the way people explain it often is that there are certain things that happen to food in the climate that
yes,
make the food just toxic, right?
right, yes,
And the kosher practice simply sort of you know uh, sidesteps that in a way,
right, yes, yes,
and that,
exactly.
that certain things to me just sort of do make sense, that people probably were like I'm pretty sure that there was probably some outside of religion reason for the infamously quoted mixing of fabrics part, you
Right,
know?
and well, I mean, like like there are many reasons for why, like if I may just quickly give a quick example, like, when it comes to being against pork, right? I kind of had spoken that like that particular area of the Levant of the and also of the Fertile Crescent is not suitable for having. In fact, if you do have pigs, the they will stomp on the ground, right? And this is something that actually cows do in America, and it causes this similar problem because again, cows were introduced to the Americas, right? They weren't here initially.
Right.
Is that they will stop is that what they do is because the ground there is dry and all these other things, right? Because the Mediterranean isn't tropical, right? Instead, it's very dry, which is why it has the climate it has. Is that then runoff would push the water off of everything, and so then plants wouldn't be able to take root, and other, so
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
and so there are these other aspects that like even they didn't know. That is to say, like now we can understand. Ah, yes, like now we understand that if you have all of these pigs as they would have existed, thousands of years ago, which they would have looked different and seen different, but are the ancestors to modern pigs, right? The ones we have now is that those things were also they weren't as it were native to that area as well, so they would have been an
Yeah.
invasive species as well too. So so when they are describing, oh, you can eat this but not this, and you can do it makes sense in that, well, the people, the Canaanite tribes, right, that when they were still tribal societies, didn't have pork, and when if people did bring over pigs, it led to massive problems, right? Overpopulation,
Yeah.
destruction of the environment, etc., and then famine,
Yeah.
and
Like
then
many,
mhm.
like, this is a very interesting topic to me, because the religion itself sort of takes on because we've discussed this a bit. I think Karasu also describes this, that Karasu says that she gets a bit frustrated with the so-called religion discourse
Yeah.
when religion is treated as just this supernatural sort of thing. Like it's basically is Christianity that is being just projected into everything everywhere all at once.
Yes. Yes.
And it's like an in great movie by the way. But it is like, to me, like, for if we take Judaism as an example, a lot of it, like, I think there is a strong for one, cultural element to Judaism, and I think there's also a strong philosophical element to Judaism, and also this constant search, even an element of constant search of what is the best way for us to organize, what is the best way for us to live our lives. It's not this set of ironically enough, commandments for you to just blindly follow. It's like a constant dialogue, a constant search for the best way to organize, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I sort of see it that
Right,
way.
and I think that's why Judaism, right, if we're gonna, it has this history of saying you do not have to be Jewish to be a good person slash a good group, like a nation of people, right? Like that is not what matters. What matters is that there are these basic aspects that we recognize that uh, like and again this is why reading the Tanakh as as a political history, one could say, of a tribal society becoming a class society over the course of the entire narrative, is that this is why you get things like the the 10 sayings, right, which Christians would call the 10 commandments, but technically the first commandment, the first mitzvah, is be fruitful and multiply. Like the first thing Hashem tells human beings is the first commandment, technically.
Right, yeah.
And so and then another thing too is the word mitzvah in Hebrew is not as is more neutral in its meaning, if not even positive, as opposed to commandment, right? Because commandment
Yeah,
has a
and
very
of course, again, I have the example of the Shabbat when the rabbi was saying, well, because always during the Shabbat is that just a topic is being, at some point, there is a bit of a conversation on these topics, right? Usually it's a one or two topics, and one of the topics was like, some of the rabbis said that the commandment of love thyself as love thy neighbor as you love yourself, and some rabbis just call it basically bullshit because it's impossible. It's just a commandment that's impossible to do. It's impossible to love someone as you love yourself. So some rabbis say that it's just it's like a very, very weak commandment that makes no sense basically, and other rabbis say that, well, it sort of does sound like it doesn't make sense, but if we try to treat wider humanity as like a parts of a bigger whole, then suddenly the commandments gains more power and makes a lot more sense. If
Right.
in that context you read love thy neighbor as you love yourself, because we're all one of a bigger whole, well, not just individuals.
Right, and I think another thing too is actually this actually is perfect that you said the final word there, individuals. That concept is a modern concept, right? So like love thy neighbor as thou lovest thyself, right? If to me to say it in Shakespearean way, is that again like and this is something that Engels in his history of private property, family, and the state, he discusses like when we read like the word family in the Torah, right? People back then and even now think that it's like a family as it exists today, right?
The nuclear family.
Right, exactly. And so
The thing that was created in the 19th century, basically.
right. And that's why like right now that you're seeing all this like red pill and like masculinist content that's like, oh, we need to go back. It's like, well, if you go back far enough, it also didn't exist either, right? Like this, like it's only been here for a very short time. In fact it's the form of family that's been around the shortest time in human history.
Yeah.
But it's
And
just
it's called tradition, which is very ironic.
Exactly. And so that's why when we read this and we think of it again as we presentize it as people, as historians would probably say, I guess as we would say, is that again we're thinking of love your neighbor, and you're thinking of like so to speak, your actual neighbor, right? And that's why people think of it as but the one way in which that has been read, again, looking at this again as a political history, is that that's also a description of that the different tribes, right, in the tribal societies that before it became a nation, right, or a people, right, that the neighbor aspect was to love the other tribes as you love
Right,
your own
as you
tribe.
love your own tribe. Yeah.
Right, and
that makes sense.
and so that was an aspect that was to say that this is where you start to see the breaking down of the tribal distinctions in the land of Canaan, right? And you begin to see more and more the development of an identity that is first called, oftentimes the Hebrews, and then the Israelites, right? Is often what they're called.
Yeah. Which I can give you a bit of trivia. In Polish, it's pronounced Canaan.
Yeah. I mean, in Hebrew it's Canaan too, but I don't know. In English they decided on Canaan, so.
I usually used to, when I hear it, I think Canaan. Did I get a sum? Did I just get a... Thank you. I have to move to... Yes. Thank you, Buffy Geek, for the subscription. Yes.
And so that's one of the things that I guess, like, when people, again, we have to look at them within their historical context, and also the fact that, as we know, the Tanakh was not written in one go, right? Like, it's not like it's by one author, right? I know theologically people want to see it as like the first 5 books of being written by Moshe, right? But even if, regardless of that, even if we look at it as a historical document, or rather as a huge compilation, right? It's a huge anthology of historical documents, right?
Yeah.
They describe, right, the political history of a people and all of these other aspects too.
Oh yeah.
And so I think that's where we have to think of this is why when Christians read a command or a mitzvah and they say, this is what it says. Well, one, it says in the Torah and the Tanakh, this isn't literal. Two, the idea of categories of people didn't exist, especially not way even farther back, like 3,500 years ago. And again, if we put it in this context or whatever, and this is what I have often brought up on my stream, that like historians and archaeologists, right, because I often show archaeology stuff on my channel, is that the most important thing is the context, right? Like, from Latin, it literally means with the text, right? Like, it's something that is required, right? Like, an archaeologist cannot tell you about a site if they just find one object. It's that this is why they have to dig in different layers and show the stratigraphy. And in the same way, as a historian, it's why, I have books all over the place, because it means that I not only have to read about one inquisitor, right? And
it becomes like oh my gosh, what's the word that perfectly encapsulates it? An avalanche.
Right. Yeah, because now I have to think of, well, what preceded the idea of race, right? In this case, as pertains to the Jewish people. Because that was the invention of the Jewish people, right? And that's...
Yeah, it's basically like whenever I had in primary school, whenever I had a history topic and went to my grandfather because he was like a the super history person that always knew the topics without prep time. He would always say, "Oh, so your topic is this. Okay, let's move back 100 years to start setting up the context for what you are
Exactly.
learning."
I mean, like, for example, like, one thing that I always, oh gosh, this happens to me all of the time, but every single time that I have to bring up 1492, right? People say, "Oh yes, the Reconquista, after they defeated Granada, that's when the Reconquista ended," and I'm like, no, actually, the Reconquista already ended 200 years prior. But if you watch every history, like the armchair historian or people like that, that are again, that aren't necessarily actual academic historians and who aren't necessarily uh, well versed on the topic, right? They will just repeat that, right? Like 1492 was when the Reconquista. No, no, no. It already had ended 200 years before, when Granada was turned into a vassal state that was allowed to only have certain aspects of autonomy, and that's the reason why the whole that's the reason why the whole the final conquest of it, so to speak, if you want to call it like that. Although the final, was so quick, was because already like its defense depended upon the Spanish, right? And
Oh,
and
one second. It needs to be said because at the end of the day, let's remember that today is a very special birthday day.
yes,
So,
of course,
welcome back, fake Alec Kyle Parker.
yes,
Because,
and happy birthday once
yes,
more.
yes, happy birthday. Also, gotta say, I'm really enjoying this conversation. It has been very insightful, if not depressing. Well, unfortunately, learning of history sometimes comes with a little bit of dose of sadness,
Yeah,
which I think we can take the sad things and sort of I think there's sort of optimism to be drawn for the future from these things that we have the I guess it's fitting place to use the word privilege to be able to learn from the past and to fight for a future that will not allow these things to repeat or happen to any other groups.
right, and that's why I think that sort of what you had mentioned earlier, why never again has to be a universal thing, is because for example, like what if I may just bring in like a current events topic, like RFK bringing up that stuff that, oh, the whatever, right, that this disease, right, it doesn't affect people who are from China as if they're all of one race or even one ethnicity. Um,
Well,
uh,
I'm not sure if you're referencing the same person, but that person also said that the illness does not affect Ashkenazi Jewish
right? No,
people.
no, no. Yes. So yes. No. Yes. Exactly. It's like those two aspects are two things of
Mhm.
like where they actually are not able to, because that so this is something I mentioned in NCC stream yesterday, is that when people bring that up, and especially when they bring up and this actually happened on what's that show called, Buffy or Zira? Do you know what that show is called that was being showed, where it has Randy and Brianna? I can't remember the name of the show. Um, anyway, it's this like show where they have supposedly a right wing
Mhm.
person and a left wing person, right? Um, and in essence, what Brianna ended up bringing up was this thing about Sephardic Jews, and I kept thinking, no, like, because she was taking what he had said on as if it were true, and bringing up this thing, it's playing into the Khazarian hypothesis. Like, this is what anti-Semites, what Nick Fuentes, for example, will always bring up, like, to say that Ashkenazi Jewish people aren't real Jewish people, because they're actually these from this from this other group, right? Whereas Sephardic people, like this is where like it becomes really strange, are more real, right? And or are real, and it's this very strange like conspiracy theory that Ashkenazi Jews aren't real, or rather they aren't real Jews. Not that they're not real, but you know what I mean.
Right.
But
Goodness.
but like when that's being brought up, I'm thinking that's like these are all the like you're adding on to the conspiracy theories that RFK is already spouting, right? Because
Yeah.
like this is why like people that talk about that want to correlate, which I mean, even the person who like like even like the idea of like the bell curve, right? That's already been disproven for already almost going 40 years, but people still decide to bring it up. Right? We'll say, oh well, but Ashkenazi Jews are the most intelligent. You know what I mean? It's like, oh well, it's not,
Yeah.
and it's like, no, like, so
And
so
there's also like as fake Alec Parker has rightfully so pointed out. The moment you have to say you're not an anti-Semite probably means you probably are.
right, yeah,
It's the classic "I'm not a racist."
right, and this is where the worst thing is that then he brought up, I have a Jewish friend who's a
Oh my
rabbi,
goodness.
and
Oh
it's Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who's notorious for literally like all of the worst right wing people that have said anti-Semitic stuff. He's willing to show up and like be like, oh no, he's cool, like don't worry, um, you know,
apparently the person who's in charge now of Zich, Zich, right?
yeah,
Like is an extreme pro government person, like a super extreme pro government person, which makes me sort of now understand the whole mishandling of the March thing that we've discussed a bit.
right,
The 22nd is the Shabbat. We can do it on Saturday. We'll just move it to Friday, late after.
I'll never forget that something like that happened to me too, where they were like, well, it's not going to be on Saturday, it's going to be on Friday night, and I'm like, do you not know how Jewish days work?
Yeah, and I'm feeling really discouraged that I have to ask this about Zich.
I know, yeah, exactly, with Zich, yeah, exactly. You would think that they would know.
Like, come on.
But,
Like,
and also like, why not Sunday? That even makes even more sense, because
yeah, exactly. My mom has a theory on why not Sunday, but
oh, okay, well,
like my mom said that it's probably because of fear of Christians. Because Sunday, the Catholic day,
right,
etc.
and then if you're having a Jewish event, then
yeah, exactly. That is like,
yeah.
And my mom said, why even be afraid? Let's just do it.
Right.
And
no.
I sort of said, if like, even if there's this fear, in that case, why not just make it Thursday?
Yeah, make it literally
close,
any
it's
other
close
day.
enough.
Yeah, Thursday.
Right?
Yeah. That works too. Yeah, instead of having to again, it's
Friday doesn't work even before late evening because people usually just prepare all day on Friday.
Yeah, like back when I was a chassid, like when I was with my parent and I was with my parents back in the day, like I would be the one that would do a lot of the I would always help with cooking. That was something I was always like allowed to do, and so I would do the baking of the challahs, right? So I would have to get like the honey and all the waiting and all the letting it rise and then kneading it down and letting it rise.
You mean the because I'm familiar with the Polish name and I want to be sure that we're talking about the same the bread dish thing, right? Yes.
Yeah, the bread. Yeah.
Chałka. Yes, in Polish it's chałka.
Okay, yeah, and in Hebrew it's challah.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Pretty similar.
But anyway, but yeah, so like I would be the one because you have to have 2 loaves in order to do the hamotzi blessing, the blessing on
Yeah.
bread. So I would have to make, at least two. So, um, but this was again back when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I actually remember once I went to this family Shabbat that was when they were gonna have their engagement party, which is a big thing in Hasidic Jewish culture, where like suddenly people you don't even know or people you do know, just like everybody shows up just to like drink something, say l'chaim, mazel tov, etc., and then they'll usually give like a devar Torah, which is again in the Hasidic world anyway, which is where they will give a short, brief discussion on the Torah, and then they will sometimes just leave, and then other people come in and go. But I remember that they had a Shabbat dinner prior to that because it was going to happen after that day, after Shabbat, and
Yeah.
they had it because all these people already had come over. They had this enormous challah that was like 2 meters long.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Also,
So
there's this funny distinction because Hala became, which again is a testament to cultures intertwining. I'm not sure. Is it just a regular thing in the U.S.
what challah?
like bread? Yeah,
I definitely would say
to
that.
just go and buy, and it's a thing that people,
Uh,
broadly speaking, eat.
I would say, well, okay, I'll put it like this. Yes, but that's all because like I do know a lot of places that make French toast with challah, right? Because it's often used for that. Um, but I also don't know if that's like just like an LA thing, or rather to say if that's like a because I live in an
Right.
urban
Because
area.
and because usually the halwa is like salty, right? It's like salt, like not salty as in the taste is more on the salty side.
It depends actually. Some people, like I have a rabbi that, well, they don't do necessarily every loaf this way, right? But I do
Yeah.
know some people that will add in like chocolate and other things because you
Okay.
can, but
Be, be,
when you
because like
but when you make the blessing, yes, you're supposed to put it in salt and then eat it. So yes, technically,
yeah,
yeah,
because
you're
like
right in that.
the Shabbat one is usually the salty one, but I know that broadly in Polish stars, a the it's sold broadly in the Polish stores, but the difference is that in the Polish stores, the sweet version is sold, and
Yeah,
that's like the
right,
distinguishing feature,
right.
that the Polish version is sweet, and the ones used like in like Shabbat etc. is not sweet.
Right. So I would say, I mean, again, very generally speaking, in America, yes, it is available pretty much everywhere. I mean, there, like, I've always been able to find it at like a quote unquote regular store, right? Um, but like if you go to Pavilions, which is here in California, Ralph's, you can find it there. Or if you go to like Trader Joe's, that's where a lot like actually Trader Joe's is known for having a lot of kosher stuff. So like that's where I know a lot of people go to get their challah from right there.
Yeah, and of course, also the difference is that the Hauka sold at the Polish stores is not kosher.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Typically, the ones that they do sell one in America, and this is very, one of the things that I would say is shows that that the sort of the widespread influence and ability of Jewish people to exist in America, which is why a lot of people who were anti-Zionist were very pro-America, for example. Um,
Right.
is that the fact that like kosher things in America are very things which are kosher, right? As such, right, that you can,
Yeah.
at a grocery store are very easy to come by, because almost everything that's made that's boxed or in a can or whatever it might be has a hextra on it because of the fact that the Jewish, as it were, the marketing, I guess, it's a market that's millions of people, so it's it's, I guess it's capitalistically speaking, it's something that they can capitalize on, right? But it does make shopping for just generally things that are
Yeah.
kosher much easier. But the only difficult things that are difficult to find is like if you do eat meat, right? Is finding kosher meat, because
Yeah.
that's the only one where
Like
it's like
the halka that I speak of sold in the Polish bakery said it's not really sort of it's not advertised or framed as a Jewish thing. It's just palka. It's just sold. It's not kosher
right,
or
right,
anything.
and
It's
and
basically just sold as a thing,
right,
and
and
it's sweet.
right, yeah, no, exactly, and like in most places, like it, like it's like it's like it's just sold as challah bread, and in fact, like a lot of people sometimes don't even know that it's necessarily a Jewish thing, right? And I guess one thing that a lot of people have told me it's like is like brioche, right? That it's like essentially like brioche, um, which is like French, like a French, because it kind of looks the same too. Because like the like at the because on the top of brioche it's kind of looks kneaded, in the same way how like challah is kneaded, but except that there are people that do all kinds of designs, like with 12 needs, or whatever it might be. And so, but anyway, yeah, you can find it, and it's not sold as
Yeah,
like Jewish bread, so to speak. It's just sold,
yeah.
it's just sold as challah. But if you and it typically it is kosher just by default. Um, so
My goodness. But yes. Oh, where? How did we get here?
I
Oh
I
yeah, the Shabbat and
yeah,
the
Shabbat, yeah,
yes.
that's right.
My goodness. Interesting enough, because I've been reading the what's the English word? Because what's the English word? The typical English word?
For
The Shabbat?
the Sabbath.
Yes. Oh, okay. Because there's this. I read the book about people of Jewish heritage and people that just want to convert, and
Mm-hmm.
among them was the explanation of the vocabulary, and the person was explaining there's the word Sabbath, but the Jewish term is Shabbat,
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing, I'm pretty sure that the Polish language just uses Shabbat, um, the the Jewish word, and we've been playing with my mom this thing that she plays that there's you have to guess the word. You have to, in the empty spaces, you have to guess the word letter by letter. You only have like 5 tries or something, and the word the Shabbat came out as one of the words to guess
Mm.
in the game.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and it's funny, interesting too, because, like, the idea of the Sabbath being on another day besides Saturday.
Oh yeah, and just
Go
one
ahead.
quickly, because there is a separate Polish word, Shabbos.
Yeah,
you
Shabbos.
know, and
Shabbos.
the word that I was actually used in the game was Shabbat, not Shabbos.
Yeah. So the way how this works is that, or the way how, pardon me, not how this works, but the way how that works is that, I guess maybe I should write it on a whiteboard so that way I can visually show it to you.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, I think maybe I know what you mean by.
um,
I hope I know what you mean, because I've learned about a game very recently when I visited a kosher store. Interestingly enough, and I think there's a. Okay, who plays the game? Can you tell?
okay, so
Who's the game for?
with the Hebrew alphabet, is it
Okay.
showing right? Is it showing like is it showing backwards,
Yeah,
or is it showing correct way for you?
it's showing. Yeah.
So you have Shin, Bet, and Taf, but taf
Tav,
can be
yes.
empty or with a dot. And in the Ashkenazi
Oh,
pronunciation,
Tav has like the. You're referring.
yeah.
Oh my gosh. Does Tav have the last version and the middle version and the.
Well, no. This is the letter itself. So some letters in Hebrew
Yeah,
have
have the final, the last version and the middle version.
what.
I call it like that.
Well, no, because see, this isn't. This could also have this inside of it. If it's within the letter, it's a different meaning.
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, I know it. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
It's the same thing like if it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
this or
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So what
Like,
that.
yeah, okay, yeah, I understand.
In Ashkenazi pronunciation, if it doesn't have if the final tav, if it has a dot, it's pronounced like a T, but if it doesn't have a dot, it's pronounced sav or an S sound. So that's why you have like Good Shabbos, right, being the Yiddish and also the Ashkenazi pronunciation Shabbos of the Hebrew of that Hebrew word, and this is why you get things like Medinas instead of Medinat,
Yes.
Koisel instead of Koitel, right? Stuff like that.
Because there's also a very interesting conversation when I went to the course, which I had to stop because of the whole incident with accident of my mom, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we stopped going to the course. We will have to revive it at some point. But it was very interesting to also hear how the Hebrew language was basically Europeized, if that makes sense, because many
Yes.
people who sort of restarted Hebrew as an everyday language were European speakers. So many things that used to exist within Hebrew that are no longer because more certain pronunciations that exist within some people still, I'm pretty sure that some people still sort of pronounce there's this distinction between people that have more of a pronunciation that use sounds that also exist in Arabic,
Mm-hmm.
and there's also speakers that are more European pronunciation, and apparently Aleph also used to have some sort of a pronunciation that has been lost.
Oh yeah.
Although I think the teacher actually said what the pronunciation was, more or less.
So
Because apparently there does exist some sort of a close equivalent in Arabic.
yeah. So well, one of them is that if it has the nikudim, typically, it would be pronounced ah, but if it has this, it's pronounced more ah, which is closer to the Arabic, like
Yeah.
like Allah, right? Like ah, it's like that.
Yeah.
Um,
And of course, nowadays the things that you show basically just are markers of what letters you read after. The a I U E O.
mm-hmm.
I
The
usually
vowels,
know
yeah.
these markers as the markers of the I U E O that goes into a word.
Right. But yes, yeah.
Which are usually not present in the writing, but
yeah. Well, it's not present in Hebrew. That's to say, in the Torah there are no vowels or nikudim, and also, but in the Chumash there are. In the prayer books there are, right? But in the Torah there isn't, and in modern Hebrew there isn't, and that's actually why Yiddishists actually felt that Hebrew was actually diminished by the fact that they decided to keep to not add in vowels, because that's something that that the Yiddish and Ladino and other Jewish languages do have, and and has often.
it's sort of considered now in Hebrew as a thing that only children things have. And
Yeah.
of course, it's also important to, I'm speaking as a beginner, so you can sort of elaborate on that much more. But the markers also do not exactly work the same in biblical Hebrew as they work in modern Hebrew.
No. Well, for one thing is that
There
there are pronunciation differences. There are like, and another thing
There's
too.
grammatical differences.
Oh yeah, many grammatical differences. I mean, like one of them is something that we already sort of touched on. Yad va, yad va shem. You don't say va shem anymore. You say va shem, right?
Yeah, and of course, our teacher told us that Hebrew is such a mess. The modern one, I mean.
Yeah. Oh, it is.
But the modern Hebrew is such a mess that you can learn the most correct modern Hebrew in the universe, but people in Israel will speak totally different Hebrew, and it changes all of the time.
Right, and one of those reasons is because, on one hand, is because when you were talking about the Europeanization of it, right? And I think to me that's a very good way of putting. Yes, that was actually part of the language wars, as they called them back then in mandatory Palestine, was that like at the Technion, right, which is when they were deciding what words would exist in modern Hebrew, right, they would look at what at European stuff in particular, right. So that's why tapuach haaretz, which means apple of the ground, right, makes sense if you know that that in French, that's how you say potato, pomme de terre, right? But it doesn't make sense if you're thinking of if you know biblical Hebrew, that literally means someone put an apple in the ground, right? So again, there's all of these. One, because of all of these modern words and introduced words, but also another thing too is that they did want to change it to, again, like even the cursive when they decided specific things like the final fe, right? They made it look like German F in cursive, right? As opposed to what it had been in other Jewish scripts before. So there's that.
And the language wars sort of make me, because one person said that it's interesting to talk about Jewishness in communism, and it reminded me of the topic of the Polish communist, I'm gonna use quotation marks here, communist in brackets, state, because after World War II, like about between 300,000 or 400,000 Polish Jewish people survived, right? Like about 10 to 12%. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a real well, of course, there were two aspects that destroyed the chance of a revival of the Jewish community in Poland after the war. One was of course, the pogroms that happened after the war, which nobody wants to talk about because the government is far right and silences all historians that wish to talk about it. And the second is the quote-unquote communist government itself, which shut down all efforts which were done to actually revive the Jewish community.
Right.
So, and it led to most people who survived leaving. Now, it's so depressing to read that there used to be 3.5 million Jewish people in Poland, and now the number is closer to 20,000?
Yeah, it's like 29, or I thought, no, or is it 24,000? Something like that.
I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's in the ballpark.
Yeah.
And there were over 300,000 people alive,
Mm-hmm.
And most of them were just basically forced to leave because of how things were, and there was a chance at revival, in my opinion.
No, there definitely was a chance for sure. And in fact, your idea that you had told me before of that there should have been a state, or rather not a state, right, so to speak, not a nation state, created in what is now Poland, that would have been a state where they essentially a revival of the Council of the Four Lands, right? With
because I've talked to people on the during conference, not necessarily I've also talked to just the regular guests, right? That came. We talked, and I said like there's this myth that's perpetuated within Poland that Polish people are the hosts and that Jewish people are guests within Poland. And I said that in my opinion it's just total nonsense that Jewish people are just as much at home as Polish people in Poland, in my
Right.
opinion.
Right, and that to me goes back to what we talked about before. I had to reset everything of Doikite, right? That it's like placeness, right? That like that the Polish Jewish community is just that. It's the Jewish community of Poland, right? It's not
Yeah.
the Jewish people in Poland are not guests. They are as
Yeah.
Polish as anyone else.
Yeah.
And that is
I honestly, I'm gonna go even step further. I'm gonna go radical. They don't need to be Polish in order not to be guests here.
sure.
People who like, I actually extend this not to just Jewish people. Like, I extend this to anyone, basically. Like, if there's like a Vietnamese community, I don't think Vietnamese people in Poland is a community of guests. I just think the moment they decide to be here, they are at home. That's it. That's all there is to it, in my opinion. I don't think there's much more.
Right.
And we, the Jewish community, have this, of course, the more grounding in the fact that there is 1,000 year of history of being here, right? There is this history that grounds it a bit more historically, but I don't see it as like oh gosh, what's the word? As
warrant for something to be so.
well, like as I don't see it as a sort of condition that needs to be sort of met, or I think that people can just be at home whenever they choose to be at home. There's no
Right.
magical blood or spirit thing that makes certain people hosts over a certain territory and other people outsiders.
yeah.
I just think it's nonsensical.
I completely agree. I mean, like, that's the reason why, like, the idea. I mean, this is the reason why I did, like, for example, like, when people try to create categories, right, to sort of distance people from Latin America, right? Like, the idea of Latino or Hispanic, right? Like, it's there to, as it were, to continue perpetuate the otherness of the people who, I mean, in one sense, are in the historical sense, in the speaking of the definition, indigenous, right? As in, there were Mexicans here when the United States invaded and stole half of the country. But also too that like it doesn't matter. Like there's this like weird like obsession with like if they would have come here in the correct way, right? Which is funny to hear from like literally people that came here and just stole like the land, like people who are proud of say their family specifically being here so long enough to where they just came here and stole. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Kid. Oh, Kid Botkin, thank you so much for following.
Who? Sorry?
Kid Botkin. And so what I would say is that one of those things, right? One of those things that is definitely, I guess, important.
I actually agree with, by the way, with Keaton here. A good chunk of Poland should have been Israel and would have been in a just world. I actually agree with this. Although I personally I wouldn't even carve out a distinction. I would say that this is the entirety of, I go even more extreme. The entirety of Poland is both Poland and Israel at the same time.
Right, no,
A two-state solution, if you may.
Well, yeah, well, I suppose you could
Jokingly,
put it
I will
like
say. Because I would see it a bit differently by...
Right. No, or I guess a two-nation solution, right, in a sense.
Yeah, more like. I jokingly
no,
because that's a term that's thrown around a lot.
Yeah, no, of course. But I think to me, like, yes, I agree with you in that I mean, we agree completely on the like. It doesn't like. There's no I like. This is why I think to me it's reprehensible and horrific when I hear people say like, "Oh, you have to meet a certain condition," which is of course always revised constantly so that you never meet that condition, right? But there are many people who, nonetheless, still try to meet said conditions, right? To be accepted by white people in the United States, right? Because they see themselves as it were, like the hosts of everybody else. Even in many cases, even with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, which is just ridiculous to me. Um, so yeah, like in my sense, it's like there are people who say like, oh, it's so weird that Mexico people that have been due to the United States not taking in refugees, right? Like there was this weird thing that I was that they did a news report about how about like, oh well, now this border city, which is interesting enough the one I lived in, Tijuana, that now it has a large Haitian, Ukrainian, Korean, all these other communities, and they're like, oh well, what about? I'm like, well, they live in Mexico, right? Like they are there. They are Tijuaneros. They are just like everybody else. Like,
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
and to me, it's like this weird thing of like, oh well, they're just here temporarily, blah blah blah, but they're really this or that. It's like no, I'm like
It's
why do
actually
you
actually
have
it doesn't. Yeah.
yeah
I'll let you finish, but I have thoughts on that as well on the whole temporary thing.
because the whole point, well, I mean, the whole point is that it's erasing the fact that one, there's already a belief in the United States that only the United States and I guess Canada ever received European immigrants, right? Or even immigration in general, right?
Which is interesting considering hello Spanish colony.
Right, exactly. But then and of course, so there's an erasure of course of the Chinese community in Mexico, other communities in Mexico as well, and also a long-standing Haitian community, and also the Black community in Mexico in general too, which is also done in Mexico on a national racist scale, but that's a whole different discussion. But the point
Yeah.
being that people will question, like now suddenly there are people that are saying, well, what about Mexican people? It's like, well, they are Mexican people, right?
Yeah.
Like they're
And
like they have made their homes in Mexico, and they're just like
yeah.
everybody else, right? And this is where people who, and they're not even, and the people that I'm talking about, this was like in a news report. I think it was from LA, KTLA, from like from like the main news outlet here, is that they specifically went on about this, like, oh, like the Mexican people are being like and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like Mexico's always been about all these different cultures coming together, and that's the whole
Yeah, of
point,
course, yeah.
and in
Yeah.
fact, like one of
That is
the
why the
yeah
US sort of hated Mexico as well
well yeah I mean
during the Manifest Destiny days,
yes
you know. But yeah, I think the temporary thing is just not an argument. Like, a temporary home is also home, so I don't really think I think it's irrelevant on whether or not it's permanent or temporary. Because, like, I will repeat it once more, a temporary home is also home. Like, you don't, like, a lot of people, most people probably, don't spend their whole lives in their parents' home, right? Are you gonna be then saying, oh, you're not, like, your home is not your home, it's just temporary, you'll move out at some point, so it's basically just a temporary situation. Can you really call it your home?
Right,
You know?
and then also, if you were to turn the tables around, say on white people, it's like, oh, well, is this your temporary home? You know what I mean? Like they wouldn't find that acceptable, right? Like in fact, this is a big problem, right? That people have noted that they're like, as soon as it's asked of them, right, that then they begin to, right, say a whole bunch of a myriad of things. That's not important, but the point being that like. Again,
Yeah.
this goes back to the conditions that people like to put. Oh yes, please go and subscribe to Lucy at the pinned link, please. Thank you. everyone. Thank you so much, Buffy. And yeah, so again, that's this like other people imposing the idea of these conditions people need to meet before being seen as part
Yeah.
of an American, right? But now they're doing it to describe who gets to be counted as a Mexican, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
why? What are you doing? Like that's like we don't do that. Like we like like our whole culture is built on the idea of cultures intermixing. In fact, one of our
Yeah.
main
Exactly.
national monuments is called La Plaza de las Tres Culturas, literally the like the national square of the three cultures that came together in the colonial period, the African, indigenous, and the European cultures, and came together to form the current, or they gave rise to the nation state, I guess, of Mexico, right? So
Yeah.
it's like whereas like the monuments in United States, they're all about just one race of people up until very recently, right?
Right.
So it's like a very different.
And I'm gonna be like I'm I would as again I would go even more like I would go even more extreme, sort of like by saying that um, people in Mexico don't need to be Mexican necessarily. Like they can just they can be ethnically or by identity anything else, and still I would say that the distinction between us and them is sort of silly and artificial. There was a thing that came sort of up during the panel about affirmative action, the WIC
Mm-hmm.
panel. I'm not sure if you've seen that,
No,
the
I
panel
don't
that
I
I've
don't
been
believe
in.
I've seen it. Oh,
That
yeah.
the topic of like the host of the panel, WIC,
Mm-hmm.
insisted that in the US it's necessary and important for everybody to become part of to become an American by knowing English, etc. And I said, well, no. Like there are whole communities that don't really speak English, that they have a language that they use and just exist within the communities that they sort of live in. And Wick was asked sarcastically, and how are those people doing? And I would say it depends, but there are certainly people that don't speak English, operate just within the communities, and they do perfectly well. Because you don't need, what you need to succeed is not, um, for a community to succeed, it doesn't need to uh, sort of assimilate into the broader culture and economy. All that the community needs is one outlet which connects to the broader economy, and the whole sort of economy of the community can perfectly well exist without needing those to sort of to do the assimilation thing.
Right, and
And they're still perfectly at home and American, so to speak,
right.
even without embracing the assimilated American identity, so to speak.
Right, and I mean, one example of this is no one would say this about Amish communities, even though they don't speak English either. They speak, a Low German, sometimes called Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's Low German because it's Deutsch, right? It comes from the same.
Yeah,
But it's Americans, hearing that word and Dutch, So, it's like they wouldn't say
yeah,
that about the Amish. In fact, anything they would say, "Oh, look, they're so successful." But it's like they explicitly do not want to be part of the broad, like they do have that as a
yeah,
word, that economic, and
yeah,
people obviously can go
yeah,
stay there and everything. But it's like they themselves feel at home wherever they are. Like they don't need a nation. Like in the same way, like Haredim that are anti-Zionists, that live in, for example, the city of Israel, like they didn't need a state of Israel to exist for them to feel at home in Jerusalem, right? Like
yeah,
that wasn't necessary. It's the imposition of the nation state idea as the bourgeois state that is the issue, right? And that's
yeah,
why, like, for that person that did say that
right,
during that, it's like, again, why is it that it's never that explicit thing is I mean, it is used only, typically speaking, in a racist context, right? To say that
yeah,
this
and
community is doing poorly because they do not. Again, this goes back to this idea that there's a cultural problem, right? But as I already said, even in the 80s, there was already an understanding that that was done. That change in language was just so that people could say race by another name, and that was by
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, well,
And
it's the
like
culture." Yeah.
what I'm saying is sort of difficult to describe in a world of nation states that's sort of dominated by nation states. But like I didn't use this example in the panel. I don't know why I sort of forgot to use it on the panel, but like before the war, there were many Jewish people in Poland before 1939 who just simply spoke Yiddish and they did not speak like a word of Polish, and they were still at home even though they were not Polish in the sort of nation state sense of knowing Polish and being assimilated into the Polish life. And like those people were still at home. They
Right.
were where they belonged.
Right, exactly. And if I may just add on to that really quickly, is that that bourgeois nationalist nation state idea imposed upon even other people who, like, I guess people would see as Polish, more by quote unquote default, would be
Yeah,
like in Italy, for example, right? Like, or even in Poland, right? Now there's a standard Polish where that had never existed before, right? Now there's a
exactly.
standard,
Yeah,
like
correct.
now there's a standard this and a standard that, and that is
Yeah,
literally flattening the culture of your own, right? I mean, that's literally flattening the
yeah,
own diversity of your own culture in
yeah.
order to.
And of course, keep in mind that that also is like a myth, a sort of like an idea that is being sort of enforced, but in practice, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in real life. In real life, many different versions of the language will still
Yes, of course.
exist, will still function, and the only sort of function as the official sort of language is, I guess, a crutch for foreigners to have like the a version of a language to learn as a foreign language.
Right. Although I guess to me one thing is, of course, saying
And
that.
this became, yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess for me, like, one aspect of that is one. I guess the situation would be different in Europe just because of the history of, like, the languages having been independent and not, as it were, like, imposed on from the outside, so to speak. So, if you understand what I'm saying, like in the Americas, right? I guess to me, I always
Mm,
think of the Americas where, like, if Spanish is the official language, that always comes to the detriment of the indigenous languages, for example, right?
yeah.
And I
As,
would
as,
say, and I would say that, like, to some extent that is the case in Europe too, but it's more the case in the global South, in the places that were colonized, right? Where
yeah.
where
Although, well, you could say that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and henceforth, and therefore all the modern nation states that form it were also for a time colonized by the free uh, empires.
right, yeah, exactly, and yes, um,
The partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth
right, between Prussia, Russia, and
and
Austria-Hungary.
Austria. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, exactly, and I think to me that's another thing too is that, well, yes, that is the case, right? But I would say that, like, one thing too is the fact that um, those languages, like Sorbian, right, like
Mm-hmm.
Silesian, Swabian, etc., right, that they again, well, one, we do know that there has been a decrease in the people speaking them, right, as their primary
Mm-hmm.
language. So again, like,
Yeah.
standardization does do that in general. It doesn't mean, however,
Yeah.
that it's going to go away in certain places. Well, in Europe necessarily, just
Interesting. Also,
right.
interestingly enough, that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had dialects of Polish that just ceased to exist with the partitions.
No,
That's another
right,
interesting.
exactly, right, yeah, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like when, like as soon as you have the nation state, like the bourgeois state, right, immediately, and again, I think it's perhaps because I'm thinking more in the colonized world, in the particularly in the Americas, right, context,
Yeah.
um, where again, like
Although Mexico sort of did it, like I believe that from what I'm learning about Mexican history, I believe that Mexico still did it better than the U.S. certainly, like where all of the heroes of the war for independence, like the oh my gosh, can you remind me once again the name of the famous Cry of Dolores
Miguel Hidalgo,
person? Yes,
Miguel Hidalgo,
Hidalgo.
yeah, Hidalgo,
Hidalgo, yes.
yeah, Hidalgo,
Yes, he was educated in indigenous languages, right?
yes, he knew
And that
Nahuatl.
was a. I'm pretty sure that was not a thing that was done in the U.S.
Oh, I mean, like, no, no, no. The U.S. has the Anglo sphere has always been about one getting rid of the other cultures that were there, and if they can't,
Right.
getting rid of it in by other means, so to speak. So,
Mm.
I mean, that's why there's this documentary that I remember. I watched, and I remember when I heard this, and in fact, there's actually an article about this that's talking about how Spanish can be used in the United States as an act of resistance, right? As a political act of resistance in a time when,
Right.
uh, you know, uh, but there was this one where it's specifically talking about indigenous peoples, and they're talking about someone who was uh, Lakota, and that he remembers being in what in Canada they would call residential schools. In America, sometimes they would just call them Indian schools, as they would call them back then. And in fact, there are still major cities in the American West, right, that have like those as street names, right, like names of those schools, or
Mm.
even that name itself, like that
Of course, I
Indian.
know Canada has some really dark history of those
Right,
things,
right,
from what I know.
and so in the United States, this man, he starts crying because he says that he remembered that because they would physically hurt them when they would speak anything but English, that they stole his tongue, as he said, right, through that
Yeah.
violence, right, and even
And also
minor.
identity as
Right,
well.
identity, right, and culture, right. I mean, like that's why there is a. I mean, this is why there is a lot of discussion that takes place with Chicanx, um, in Chicanx studies, and also in alongside indigenous studies, or Native American studies, where the discussion is, if there was, like, how do we conceptualize the land that Chicanos call Aslan, that
Yeah.
and the overlap that is there
Yeah.
with indigenous peoples, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is always that most people would say that the deference goes to the indigenous peoples, because of course the whole concept of Aslan is based on the idea of being an indigenous people as well. So anyway, but it's like
Yeah.
where like the reservation system in the United States and elsewhere, it's like that wasn't done out of an act of mercy. That was done as another way to legitimize their
Supremacy.
right, white supremacy, and to legitimize the genocide of the indigenous peoples. It was a way to exacerbate it, if anything.
Yeah. Like
So.
there's a thing in the chat, and I will also continue because the language topic is very interesting.
Mhm.
Don't think this from Kidney in the chat. Don't think this is necessarily inherent to a bourgeois state. Specifically, it's simply inherent to the state period. It seeks to centralize and encompass all. So unified formalized language will be a predictable move. Also, I sort of want to push back against it a little bit
Yeah, me too.
because like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a state, like a composite state, but still a state. And it was like the whole point of the Commonwealth that it was like extremely decentralized, and it sort of it had baked into law by nobles for their own interests, but still,
Yeah.
like it ended up being a thing that it was baked into law that the languages of the so-called outskirts or any other people would be respected and not trampled upon. That is why the Lithuanian language was able to thrive within the Commonwealth, which is why um, Jewish people were able to use just Yiddish and without any. There was there's it's not an over exaggeration that's to say that like it was an extremely multicultural, multilingual like country as well. Like the Tatars that lived in the Commonwealth, they sort of transcribed, like they did, I think, use Polish as well, but they transcribed like the writings of Islam by using Polish and Arabic script, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of this sort of um, like because the nobles were terrified of allowing the king to centralize anything, so they constantly kept it in check to sort of like I think there was this saying that there had to be this um, certain balance between the king who had almost no power and the nobles who basically had the power, that the like the saying was that if the king has too power it will lead to tyranny, and if the nobles have too much power it will lead to anarchy. That's basically what the saying was, you know?
Yeah, no, it makes me laugh because it's interesting because Mexico itself has had this issue since its founding, right? Where it's had two camps, right? The Federalist camp that wanted to have kind of like again the constituent states of the United Mexican States, as technically the official name of the country is. And then greetings, it is I, Comrade of Comrade Nebraska. Hello, Adadak, it's so good to see you. Um, and then the centralists, right, who wanted the power that from the colonial period had always been in the nucleus of the colonial center being Mexico City, right? And like the 19th century could essentially be described as Mexico, one having actual like wars, but also having specifically like those questions, like are we a composite state that was brought together through the colonization by the Spanish, and therefore we should recognize the autonomy of, and in fact this is partially the reason why in the 1917 Constitution, all of the like, it's in the title of many universities where they will say La Universidad Autónoma, of like that there's this autonomy from, right, because of this idea of like, well, the university can be funded by the state, but it cannot be, as it were, controlled by the state, right?
Yeah.
So it's like thought of in the Constitution where like the government cannot use money as a way to get a university to agree with it, so to speak, right? So there's a lot of things like that, and in the 1917 Constitution, but also too, and that's why like parts of Mexico have declared independence prior, like Yucatan, for example. It was its own separate republic for a while, and it was trying to get, interestingly enough, England to help it, so that way it could, so that way England would invade Mexico and then let Yucatan be free, and it didn't work out, unfortunately, it seems. But there is.
Oh god, like I have to say that when I started learning Mexican history, especially the period of the fight for independence, like the ideals, the people who fought for it, like the Hidalgo, right?
Yeah, Hidalgo, Morelos.
Hidalgo, yeah, like he basically wanted to uplift the poor, the indigenous, etc. I can't help but to think, oh my God, Mexico should have been the dominant country on the continent. I don't know. And it had such potential to be such like the foundation was so much better than the U.S. I'll just say that much.
Well, again, but then this also goes into the question of, I mean, we can't. Well, I guess I would want to reframe it in this way. The vision of say of Mexico's independence movement, right? Has to be, we have to put it in the context in which it existed. Like the reason why, for example, France and Spain had no problem, for example, making the American Revolution, right, come to fruition, is because it essentially was a dispute between two bourgeoisies, right?
Yeah,
So they wanted to support the bourgeoisie that would help them, right? Um,
yeah,
Whereas, like, for example, this is often said as a reason why Mexico is failed, quote unquote, for a while anyway, is that the reason why Mexico then restricted immigration from Europe in particular in the beginning, or at least the idea behind it, was that they did not want whiteness or white people to come and just like reorganize the racial caste system they had just finished abolishing, right? So the idea of limiting that immigration was in the idea that if people are coming from Europe, they're going to want to reconstitute the racial caste system, right? And so like when you see these laws that were put into place and that of course there were many exceptions, right? But the whole point was like again, they did not want to recreate the racial caste system imposed by the Spanish
yeah,
for 400 years, 500 years, etc., or for 300 years, I should say. And they did not also want, because again, with the decision to make everybody equal, right, regardless of race, and the ending of slavery, etc., those things were still seen by France and, I mean, Britain, etc. At that point, where, I mean, Britain still had still had slavery in its colonies. France still had slavery in its colonies, right?
yeah.
And so, and looking at it in that context, you can see why, like,
Vietnam.
right, exactly, and with, I mean, even with its colonies, British, French colonies, Dutch colonies abroad, right? You can see why, like, the better foundation, say, of the Mexican Revolution, which was against a racial caste system, slavery, the Inquisition, etc., right, all at once, right? Uh, it was not given the same air, right? The amount of oxygen it needed to be successful as the United States one, where it essentially was implied that, oh, it's just for the bourgeoisie that are going to have power, right?
Yeah,
And that it would be a sort of another power to work with that also can produce primary materials that can compete with the British Empire, right? With against Spanish and French,
yeah,
so in that sense, like if you read it in that sense, it's like, and then also taking into account imperialism, right, which was the thing pretty much immediately, especially once the United States started, really began to expand. Then you can see why Mexico revolted against the. Yeah, it was still running until that time. It did not end until Spain, right? Until the Spanish were officially kicked out of Veracruz, out of the fortress of.
1921.
Yeah, in 1821, they still
1821. Yeah.
technically had the Inquisition going on. So, but the anywhere that was
Um,
liberated by Hidalgo and later Morelos, etc., and Guerrero, they already abolished slavery, the Inquisition, etc. It still was ongoing. Spain never rescinded the edict of expulsion until like 1968, right? Like way after. Or is it 1978? I don't know. It's a year that ends with 8, but I think it's 78 because I think it was after Franco. So yeah, 78. So yeah, so even Spain didn't get rid of it, and the Inquisition technically still exists. It's the office for the
Oh God.
yeah, you know.
My goodness.
Well, I mean,
And of course,
it still exists at the Vatican as an office. Like it's just been renamed and now it does
uh,
something else. But
right. Of course, as Karasa has pointed out, there was a push in Hungary by Kosovo's majority to create a Duna River alliance of states that would wish to have a baked-in instrument of respect of other groups. So not all states should be aimed to be the same national state construct.
uh, and another
Yeah,
thing too is also within that context, if I may just add, remember that
of
Latin
course.
America, due to Bolivar and as well as other people, right, want to unite the entire landmass, right, and that's still seen as a thing that is still an ongoing principle of the Bolivarian revolutions, right, but also of all of Latin America, right, is that the desire to not have to compete against one another, right? Like that's something that benefited the imperial powers of the time, for there to be small nation states as opposed to one large multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-confessional, etc., space. So even from the beginning, right, even though Mexico, had to do the nation state thing, right, the things, the ideals for the unification of all of Latin America into one, I guess, state, I guess is one way of thinking of it, but one area, is still something that even to this day is
Yeah,
still held in high regard. It's still seen as, I mean, there are still ideas of integration, as they would say, in Spanish, right? To unite
yeah. As
all of the
opposed to immigration.
right,
As opposed to like, God, what's the word? Integration as opposed to mm, assimilation. Yes.
right, and so that's where, like, this is why, like, and I don't think that these are good equivalents, right? But like in modern time, I think there are things like Mercosur, which allows people in the southern cone, in particular, to travel to each other's country, right? To live in each other, kind of like the European Union, but it's in South America, right? But then there are other such things that are working, that the ideal of that, of having, like, why is it that when we were all colonized, we were all together, right? Why is it now that we
Mm-hmm.
are we are created into these artificial nation states? um,
Yeah.
and so that's where all of the ideals can be put together, and then be thought of in a larger, wider context, right? That Latin America and the Caribbean, by extension, want to be like essentially the Latin American Caribbean Commonwealth, right, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And then, like, ironically enough, the main part um, that sort of bears the main part that prospers in the nation state is the state, basically, because
Right,
the nation is like a tool. The more homogenic the nation is, the easier it is to control. The less friction you will have, the less different sort of opinions and beliefs you will have to deal with. It's just an easier group to control.
right, and not only that, but it also begins to allow you to do, one, the centralization, which again the Inquisition helped with
Yeah,
that, right? And also capital accumulation. That's something
yeah,
that also occurs in that context, which is why, again, like the problem that a lot of people had with, like, the Haitian Revolution, like I think emblematically the Haitian Revolution is, and the reason why, for example, Haiti is to this day is still held in very low regard, even by people who claim to be very, progressive, etc., even leftist, is that Haiti is perhaps the case to show how all the imperial powers are willing to sink their differences together when it came to singling out a state that, a revolution that actually upheld I mean, like I'll never forget it. I'll never forget this story that C.L.R. James brings up in the Black Jacobins, and it's that Napoleon, who's often seen as like the apotheosis, right, like the highest representation of the. In fact, in War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Count Bazukov says, Napoleon rose above the revolution and put to an end its successes and blah blah blah. Right? He was like the summation of it. Right? The culmination. Is that when after Napoleon had sold off Louisiana to the United States to get the money to then send the French army to go retake Saint-Domingue, or what is now called, which now includes the Dominican Republic in the east and in the west, Haiti, is that when the French soldiers were marching towards on this beach, right? It was like a foggy, right? It was really early in the morning, and as they were approaching for the first time the Haitian army, right? They heard them singing. They heard the Haitians singing La Marseillaise, which is now the national anthem of France, which is the revolutionary anthem of the French Revolution. Like, they were the ones
Right.
singing it. They're the ones like, oh, have you come here to join us in our war to liberate ourselves? And it was no, right? Like, the Haitians were the ones that actually upheld the revolution. They were the ones that rose above, and etc. And France made sure that it never, it tried to snuff out the Haitian Revolution, and that's why, like, even the U.S. and Canada, etc., to this day, it's been taken out of the news cycle, but like Canada sent like military equipment to essentially install a police state in Haiti, right? And then you also have Papa Doc and Baby Doc, right? In the late 20th century by the United States, right? Backed by the United States. So again, like we also have to take those things into consideration too.
And of course, you have one of the things that I can look at and say, oh, one nice thing that happened was in the Haiti thing, when the Polish soldiers sort of, because Napoleon was a big figure for Polish people, because he promised to recreate the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Polish people fought in Haiti, and then they sort of started admiring Haiti freedom fighters and just switched sides and started fighting the Napoleon forces and helped Haiti in gaining the independence.
Mm-hmm. No,
are you familiar?
Yes, like I'm familiar that the peoples that were included were people from the rest of the what at that time was like the Napoleonic right, Europe, essentially, like pretty much all of continental Europe. But I didn't know anything. Oh, I did know that historically the Polish people did view Napoleon as a way, because I think it's the War of the Second Coalition, where he was specifically trying to defeat Russia. Before 1812, right? Before all that. But
It's like it started from the fact that Napoleon has officially said that the partitions were illegal.
mm-hmm.
It was one thing, and he also promised to recreate it, and then he created the Duchy of Warsaw thing as well.
Right, yes, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is then later which was the part that was given to the Russians later on.
Russia, yeah.
Yeah.
But still, even with all that Polish soldiers in Haiti were like, wait, these people are basically like us, and just switched sides and started fighting alongside them.
Right, and this is the reason why, a lot of people who are from countries like Poland, right, from the former Yugoslavia, etc., Ukraine, why when they often will go to places like Latin America, they will feel, and like, for example, the reason why many people after the Cuban Revolution became like, even like people who, for example, were very much opposed to the governments aligned with the Warsaw Pact governments, right? Um, thought that, well, now that socialism is being tried in Cuba, right, that it can't be the same
Hmm.
as it is in Eastern Europe because it doesn't have
Yeah.
that, obviously, you know, kind of ignoring the whole Khrushchev and Fidel being, well, at least, sort of being friends, right? At least knowing of each other and relying on each other. But like that's why many people did move to Cuba at that time as well, because they were disaffected with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but they still, for example, still thought that
Mm.
perhaps in Latin America, right, that the oppression, right, that the shared oppression that they had of not being allowed to express themselves nationally, et cetera, or
Right.
whatever it might be, that they could actually find it in a socialist sense, right? But also, too, I would say this is also why you have during the French intervention which happens within the span of the American Civil War, because the United States cannot imperialize the Latin America on its own at that moment. That's when France decides to install Habsburg in charge of
Mm.
charge of Mexico. Is that they also brought a lot of colonial soldiers as well, and when like famously people remember the Battle of Puebla because that happened on Cinco de Mayo, right, the 5th of May. But what actually ended up happening is that many of the soldiers who were from France of this time, and who were also from other, allied countries, but mostly were from France, is that some of them, that's actually what started, for example, the usage of specific type of clothing, right? Because then you see soldiers staying in Mexico, like they go there and then they realize like, oh
Mm.
no, like they kind of do that meme like, are we the
Are we the
baddies?
baddies?
Yeah, exactly. And then they're like, oh crap, we are, right? And then it's like
Yeah.
so that's something that ends up happening quite a lot, like when people try to do something in Latin America. Is like, I mean, that's the reason why, for example, Che became, radicalized, so to speak, by going to more Latin American countries, right? By seeing the
Yeah.
oppression as it went on, as opposed to just staying in Buenos Aires, just staying as a
Mm.
bourgeois, as a petit bourgeois person.
Also, I'm not sure how much it happened in the Latin America, but like the Haiti thing sort of was a reverse um, example, because we have whiteness that can be taken away and given, etc. Right? We
Yes.
discussed this at the beginning of our talk, and in the case of Haiti, when the republic was formed, the Haiti Republic was formed, the Polish soldiers that sort of helped to win the fight for independence, the Polish soldiers were given the official legal status of black.
Right, because Haiti
Interestingly
was
enough.
like the first black republic in the world, right? I mean, that's often
Yeah,
how
and the,
it's
like and the Polish soldiers were like light skinned. Obviously, were
yes,
given like the
right.
official title. Like in it was, yeah, it was just official in law. They were given the status of
But
black.
but I think it's important that it's interesting because that disproves a lot of the people that talk about like anti-white racism, right? Like in the sense that it shows how that category or the categories, right, that are race, right, are by definition social constructions because
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I believe so. Yeah.
because what allowed them to be oppressed, right, was the fact that they had become by via the Europeans black, right? Like there's nothing to say that someone
Yeah.
from northwestern Ghana and southeastern Botswana have anything in common except for the fact that they happen to live on this vast landmass here,
Yeah, Africa
right?
is big. People often underestimate just how big Africa is.
Right, and but I mean, but even so, it's like people like yet people who would often bring up the idea of anti-white racism are like, oh well, this town in Italy is like a million trillion percent different from this village over here, and it's 3 miles away, right? It's like you know what I mean? It's like this very strange thing,
Yeah.
but it shows that the reason why this is the reason why the violence against Haiti never ended is because is because of that idea that now an oppressed people, right, an oppressed category, could now become equal to the oppressing category. And that's the
Yeah.
reason why you see in a lot of the places in Latin America where they immediately want to, either snuff out the revolutions, or, in the other case, they want to help them via imperialism, right? And that is
Yeah.
because they know that the comprador bourgeoisie will be the white people of those countries, and so they know
Mm.
that, and that's what extends in many ways the racial caste system of the which had been officially
Yeah.
abolished, but now.
And like
Mhm.
as
Yeah, please go
yeah.
on. No, please go on.
As Karasu said in the chat, Polish who fought in at the side of Haiti, the Polish people have been incorporated. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Right, and in fact,
Like it's yeah.
there's actually a story of a secret Jewish. Well, I mean, he had to do this, right? He had
Mm-hmm.
to join a monastery, right, at the time, because again, this is during the Inquisition, right?
Yeah.
That he actually went and left Mexico because Mexico was its revolution hadn't started yet, right? Because Hades began in 1805. And that he actually got on a ship in order to go fight in that, because one of the things was that when he discovered that they all of the oppressed peoples, right, like hence why Polish people as well as other peoples were identifying with the Haitian Revolution, is that by definition the French anti-Jewish laws would be lifted. So he would finally be free in the one place where they had lifted where they would get rid of those laws. And so this was technically New Spain at that point, leaving, right. And he also was very learned in indigenous languages too, and also indigenous medicine, which is often called curanderismo, but again, that's to specify what kind of medicine it is. But he actually ran off from the monastery to go fight in the revolution, because he did not want to stay, have to be hidden anymore, right? Like that's something
Yeah.
where as it were, like he didn't want to stay in the closet. He was willing to fight for his right to not have to be in the
Yeah.
closet anymore, so to speak.
That's
So,
right. And it also, I think the Heidi example sort of demonstrates this is why we should learn more history, okay?
yes.
This is why more people should be history nerds. Because this example just disproves the narrative that is often sort of, well, mostly by bigots, but that, oh, if the minority group that is being oppressed will win any sort of freedom, they will exact revenge against the. Well, no, that's not how it works. Like when the when Haiti became a republic, it didn't turn around and, well, you Polish soldiers might have helped us now, but that you were part of the oppressors, so guess we're just gonna have to kill you all.
Well, I mean, and
It's
again,
not how it.
right.
It's not how it went down. They received like the legal status of black, and they just stayed forever, and their descendants still sort of live there.
Right, and exactly. And in all of the revolutions in Latin America, you have that exact same thing where it's like white people were never I mean, with very few exceptions, of course, some of them being Argentina, which is like and Uruguay, which is the most white in terms of percentage.
Argentina is a whole thing we could be talking about how, especially since there's a certain creator that really loves whitewashing Argentina by the name of Baram Penada, and like the colonizer from Australia that came to Argentina. But I digress. Like the like Argentina that basically did a genocide and bragged about it. That Argentina.
Yes, Argentina that did the conquest of the South, as it's called, and also, I mean, Argentina is also where they had the concentration camps. in
Like
the
the
in
one
the
that
70s.
the one that basically got rid of its black population and bragged about it.
Right. Yeah. And then
Like, come
and then not
on.
only that, but then stole their music, right? Like
Yeah,
still sold their music, and now said, oh well, now it's Argentine, like the national music, because now the Parisians like it, right? But only attributed to white composers, to white musicians. Yeah, there's a lot to speak there, and that's what I'm saying. Like, there are exceptions to this rule, but like, this is why in like Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, right, the republics of Central America, which at one point were federated, became one united country. Mexico, for example, um, that is one of the reasons why, you know, you have you do not have any of those supposed things that are going to happen. In fact, it's
yeah,
the exact
exactly.
opposite. It's that when white people came to conquer, to steal, etc., they are the ones that did the genociding. Um,
Yeah,
and they're the ones that made it systematic, especially. And I think, that's why, like, it this is more a thing in the United States, right, where it's a white majority, right, whatever that even means, right, country, right. But it's like,
yeah.
how do you think this entire
And oh god,
continental
I've got
landmass.
another tangent, but I will wait for you to finish.
Oh no,
Oh
no,
god,
but it's just like,
because
how do you think
like
that this huge continental landmass got to become majority of European descent, quote
yeah,
unquote, right?
of course. His conversation, if you can call it, with Matt Banjo was insane. Yeah,
With
but
whom?
like because there was this video, it has been bashed by everybody involved, so I'm not gonna even talk about the video itself. But there's this video that makes the claim that the term minority is just a neutral concept that refers to absolute numbers or something like that. And no,
No.
the term minority has never been neutral. Like it basically came to be again with the rise of the nation state, when certain groups of quote unquote outsiders were identified suddenly as a minority in the country that can either shut up and assimilate and behave or get out. That was like the meaning of the word minority. It wasn't just some neutral term to it was not neutral from its inception. Not sure if you sort of
Mm-hmm.
what your with your opinion, but yeah, the terms majority and especially national majority and minority, they were never neutral terms. Like before, like in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, you didn't have the term minority and majority because those are very nation specific terms, nation state specific terms. You know? Like
Right.
Jewish people were their own separate class at the time, which is a whole different topic, but there was no, the majority of the country and minority of the country.
Right.
And to people that love to call the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth just Poland, Polish people ethnically constituted just 40% of the whole population.
Right, and then this goes back to the thing of like, when we were talking about language, right? That like, well, in 1880, more than 80% of French people, or as they would be called, right, people in the nation state of France, couldn't speak French. So, like, would they not be
Yeah.
French anymore, right? Would that mean that only 50% of all the people are French then? So, again, I think these are very, very important questions and everything that, obviously lead to so many more discussions. And that's why I'm so glad that, we've taken this time to discuss it and to really get in depth. And I do have to get going now in a minute.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Basically this is why I started the um, this is why I started the stream earlier, sort of making it more suited to your schedule because I know that for us to have a conversation, there needs to be at least like 2 or 3 hours set aside.
yes, of course, yes. So anyway, Well, anyway, it was really nice speaking with you, Lucy, and thank you so
Yeah,
much,
we
Lucy's
have to
chat.
do it again.
Definitely, always. Oh, it's the invitation is always open. And
True.
also, Chad, thank you so much, everyone. Oh, hi, the Cubit. Oh, we're doing great, thank you. And so, yeah, thank you again, Lucy and your chat as well.
Yes,
Thank you so
and
much.
before you go, I will leave you with this bittersweet treat of telling you that there exists in the ether the Bada Empanada video that he did about me.
Oh, right.
So if
uh,
you ever wanna sort of in your moments of you know when you like wanna watch something, you can always turn that on and cringe a bit at what's happening.
okay, sounds good. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'll
Okay,
see you soon.
see you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Okay, so hello everyone. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in that wonderful conversation with Lucy. It truly was very interesting, and to talk about all of these things. And so I think I'm gonna actually leave it here because I'm actually didn't really have much breakfast because I think I mentioned that my puppy had surgery, and so I've been taking care of her, right, being even more doubtful than usual due to a need to do so, right? So I'm gonna go check in on her, and yeah, thank you guys, thank you everybody for joining me for this stream, for this conversation. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it entertaining, and worth watching, even beyond entertaining, of course. So anyway, I just need to find someone to raid. Let's see here. Um, let's see, who can we raid? Okay, I think I know who we can raid. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Make sure to get in that machine. Let's go. Make sure to tell James hi.